There are facts hidden inside the Pokémon franchise that most players pass over without a second thought. Details folded so quietly into the games that only the most careful eyes ever find them. They sit in the code, in the Pokédex entries, in the names of moves and places and characters, waiting for someone to stop long enough to notice. This is a journey through the ones that slipped past nearly everyone, the pieces of information that feel almost impossible to believe even after you have read them twice. Before you drift any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. The Pokémon world carries its secrets lightly, the way a Pokédex entry sometimes says something extraordinary, in the same plain voice it uses to say everything else. The numbers and names and locations seem ordinary enough on the surface, but underneath those surfaces, something remarkable has always been running. Some of these hidden truths concern single moves, some concern legendary creatures, some concern places and items that players walked past hundreds of times without understanding what they were actually seeing. Spinda is a Pokémon that many players remember for its spotted, swaying appearance, that small normal type that seems to stumble wherever it walks. What far fewer players ever stop to calculate is that the spots on a Spinda's body are not decorative in a simple way. Each spot is procedurally generated from the Pokémon's individual personality value, a hidden number embedded in its data when it appears in the wild. That personality value produces a pattern that shifts the position of each spot independently, and the result of all those possible combinations is a number so large it is difficult to fully hold in mind. The precise odds of encountering two Spinda with exactly identical spot patterns are 1 in 4.3 billion. That figure is not an approximation or an estimate drawn from community research. It is the mathematically confirmed result of how many unique personality values the game engine can generate and how those values translate into spot placement. In practical terms, it means that in any given generation where Spinda can be caught in the wild, every single Spinda a player has ever encountered is functionally unique. Every one of those small tilting creatures was unlike every other one that has ever existed in any other person's game. What makes this detail particularly remarkable is how invisible it is during ordinary play. A player who catches dozens of Spinda across a lifetime of games is unlikely to ever hold two side by side and notice the difference. The variation exists entirely below the level of casual observation written into the game's mathematics in a way that only becomes apparent when someone sits down and works through the numbers. It is a form of hidden complexity that asks nothing of the player who does not seek it, but rewards enormously the one who does. This is one of the quieter ways that the franchise has always acknowledged the scale of its own world. Rather than making Spinda's uniqueness part of its story in any explicit way, the designers simply built the fact into the code and let it sit there, patient and enormous, for the rare players who would eventually find it. There is a move in the franchise called Fire Fang, and it holds a distinction that belongs to no other fire-type attack in the entire series. Among all the fire-type moves ever introduced across every generation, Fire Fang is the only one that carries a chance to make the target flinch. Every other fire-type move in the game, whether it burns, whether it lowers stats, whether it hits multiple targets, or bypasses protection, none of them produce flinching as a secondary effect. Fire Fang does. This seems like a small thing at first. Flinching is a common secondary effect in the game, appearing on moves from many different types, so the idea that one fire-type move carries it might not seem especially notable, but when that fact is set against the full history of the type, against every generation of design decisions and every new fire move ever created, the singularity of it becomes something worth sitting with. Designers have introduced fire-type moves across more than 20 years and more than 9 generations of games, and in all that time, the combination of fire and flinch has appeared exactly once, in exactly one move. Fire Fang is a physical move with moderate power, learned by a range of Pokémon, including some that would not immediately come to mind as fire-type specialists. Its flinch chance is 10%, which is low enough to be unreliable in any single battle, but meaningful over the course of many encounters. A player who knows this detail has a small but genuine strategic advantage over one who does not, because they understand something about their opponent's move that the type alone does not reveal. There is something quietly satisfying about a fact that lives at the intersection of a simple rule and a long history. The fire type has been part of the game from the very beginning. Its moves have been designed and redesigned across every generation, and through all of it, one small 10% chance tucked inside a single biting attack has remained unchallenged in its category. Johto is a region built around tradition and history, and its gym leaders often carry that weight in the details of how they are introduced. When a player defeats Bugsy, the young gym leader of Azalea Town who specializes in bug-type Pokémon, they receive TM49. That by itself is a standard interaction, the exchange a player expects after clearing a gym. But Bugsy does not simply hand over the disc and step aside. He makes a specific claim. He states that he personally discovered the move Fury Cutter. This is an extraordinary piece of in-game lore that most players registered only as dialogue flavoring and quickly moved past. But taken seriously, it places Bugsy within the internal history of the Pokémon world in a way that very few non-legendary characters occupy. Fury Cutter is a real move with game mechanics and damage calculations and a place in competitive and casual play alike. And according to the game's own canonical text, the human character standing in front of the player is the one who found it. The franchise rarely gives its gym leaders backstory in this kind of specific, factual form. Most leaders are defined by their type specialty, their personality, their dialogue during the battle itself. Bugsy is defined by all of those things too, but he is also defined by an act of research and discovery that the game presents as genuine history. He is not merely a trainer who likes bug types. He is someone who studied them deeply enough to identify something new. It is one of those details that rewards a player who is paying attention not just to the battle, but to the words. Bugsy says something specific and true about himself, and then the player takes the move and continues northward, and the claim he made sits there in the game's lore, patient and unremarked for anyone who ever thinks back on it. Some things in the franchise evolve slowly across generations in ways that feel natural and continuous, and then the finished form arrives, and it is only looking backward that the increments become visible. The title used for Team Rocket's foot soldiers is one of these quiet evolutions. In the original games, the ordinary members of Team Rocket were called simply Rocket, a single word, bare and functional, carrying none of the organizational texture the franchise would eventually build into its villain groups. By the time Gold and Silver arrived and carried players into Johto, the name had gained something. Grunt had been added to the front, making it Rocket Grunt, a small change that suddenly gave the organization a sense of internal hierarchy, a distinction between the members who did the ordinary work of being villains and whatever else might sit above them. The word grunt implies a structure, implies that there are levels, implies that what the player is fighting is not at the top of the team, but somewhere closer to the bottom. And then Generation 3 arrived, and Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald, and the full name appeared for the first time. Team Rocket Grunt, the complete title that has persisted ever since, that now reads naturally and obviously to any longtime player who encounters it. 3 words where there was once one. a title that took 3 entire generations of the franchise to arrive at its finished form. It is tempting to read this as simply a matter of localization, evolving, of translation and game development, growing more sophisticated across years of iteration. But it also reads as a mirror of how villain organizations in the franchise developed as a concept. Team Rocket in Generation 1 was relatively flat. By Generation 3, the idea of a structured criminal organization with ranks and roles had deepened considerably, and the names of the trainer classes had deepened alongside it. There's a statue in Eterna City in Pokémon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl that most players walk past in the course of exploring the city, and it reads as a memorial or a monument to the region's history, the kind of decorative element that fills a game world and gives it texture. But when a player looks at that statue with the knowledge of what it actually represents, something shifts. The statue contains both Dialga and Palkia simultaneously, their forms merged into a single sculpture in a way that creates an image that cannot be read as either one alone. This is an optical illusion built into the stone of a fictional city. Depending on the angle from which the player approaches, depending on which details draw the eye first, the statue resolves into one legendary Pokémon or the other. The features are shared between the two in precisely calibrated ways. What looks like Dialga from one perspective becomes Palkia from another, and neither reading is wrong because the sculpture was designed to hold both. The Sinnoh region is built around the mythology of Dialga and Palkia, around the tension between time and space, around the idea that two enormous forces exist in fundamental relationship to each other. The statue in Eterna City expresses that relationship in a form that does not require the player to understand any of the lore to encounter. They simply see a stone figure that seems to shift, and the shift is the message. What is particularly elegant about this detail is how long it lived quietly in Diamond and Pearl before it was widely discussed. Players saw the statue, players knew it referenced the legendaries, but the specific optical illusion quality of the design, the way it genuinely refuses to collapse into one or the other, was something many players passed over without registering what was actually happening in the image in front of them. Heart scales are items in the franchise that a player encounters relatively early and returns to throughout the game, bringing them to a specific character in exchange for the ability to teach a Pokémon a move it previously knew. They are useful and common enough that most players develop a mechanical relationship with them without thinking too hard about what they represent within the world. The Pokédex and item descriptions, though, contain something more layered than the simple exchange economy suggests. Heart scales are most commonly found on Luvdisk, a water-type Pokémon shaped like a heart, and the visual logic of a heart-shaped creature dropping heart-shaped scales is straightforward and decorative. But in the Alola region, heart scales can also be found on the ground in Pony Canyon, and that location is specific enough to suggest something. Pony Canyon is an area where Jangmo-O and its evolutions are found, a line of dragon-type Pokémon whose defining visual feature is a set of scales arranged on the head in a pattern that closely resembles a heart. The implication carried quietly across these location details is that the heart scales found in Pony Canyon are not Luvdisk scales at all. They are the shed scales of Jangmo-O. The dragon sheds them as it grows, as the scales on its head develop and mature, and they fall to the ground and wait to be found by a trainer passing through. A simple item suddenly becomes a piece of natural history, a record of creatures that passed through a canyon and left something behind. This kind of layered environmental storytelling is present throughout the franchise, but is easy to miss because it does not announce itself. There is no dialogue that explains this connection, no Pokédex entry that states it directly. The connection is built from geography and visual design, and the quiet logic of a world that is more internally consistent than it needs to be. Most flying type Pokémon can learn the move Fly. This is so widely true, so reliable as an assumption, that most players would never think to question it or look for the exceptions. Fly is the move that carries a trainer across the map, the one that makes exploration efficient, the one that every playthrough eventually relies on to get from one city to another with minimum delay. A flying type not knowing Fly seems like a contradiction in terms, but the category of bug and flying dual-type Pokémon introduces an exception to this assumption that is both surprising and internally consistent with how the game works. Butterfree cannot learn Fly. Beautifully cannot learn Fly. The Pokémon in this dual-type pairing that feel most visually like they would float effortlessly through the sky simply cannot execute the move that would let them carry a trainer across the map. The reason lives in the technical specifications of the move rather than in any lore about the Pokémon themselves. Fly requires a Pokémon capable of carrying a trainer across long distances, and the small, delicate wing structure of most bug and flying types is not suited to that task within the game's internal logic. The move is as much about transportation as it is about combat, and the game makes a consistent distinction between a Pokémon that can fly and a Pokémon that can serve as reliable aerial transport. It is one of those moments where a rule that seemed simple reveals a layer of thought underneath it. The franchise did not simply distribute Fly to all flying-type Pokémon and call it done. Someone thought about which creatures could plausibly carry a person through the air and built that consideration into the move's distribution. The result is an exception that players rarely encounter because the Pokémon who cannot learn Fly are often not the ones players are looking to put in that role, but the exception is there, consistent and specific in the data. Lieutenant Surge commands the Vermilion City Gym in Kanto with the kind of direct, no-nonsense energy that his design communicates before he says a word. He is a trainer who favors electric types, who keeps his gym behind a puzzle involving trash cans, who battles with the confidence of someone who has never doubted his approach to anything. In the mainline games, he runs his gym the way most leaders do, fielding several Pokémon and testing the player across a full battle. But Pokémon Yellow introduced a specific version of this encounter that stands apart from nearly every other gym battle in the franchise's history. In Yellow, when a player faces Lieutenant Surge, he uses exactly one Pokémon, his Raichu. The battle does not expand across a party. It does not test the player's team against multiple threats. It is a single powerful Pokémon against whatever the player chooses to lead with, and the encounter ends when that one Pokémon falls. This makes Surge one of the very few gym leaders in the entire franchise to run a single Pokémon gym battle in a core game, and it gives the encounter a different texture than the multi-Pokémon gym battles that are far more common. There is something almost confrontational about a trainer who sends out one Pokémon and stands entirely behind that choice. It communicates a kind of confidence that is appropriate to Surge's character, but it is also one of the quieter design anomalies that Yellow contains among its many variations from the red and blue originals. The decision to compress Surge's team to a single Pokémon in Yellow seems connected to Yellow's overall effort to align more closely with the anime, where gym battles sometimes had a more focused character. But whatever the reasoning, the result is a moment that players who encountered it remember differently from the gym battles that surrounded it. Cherrim is a grass-type Pokémon introduced in Generation 4, and it carries a transformation mechanic built around weather. When the sun is harsh in battle, Cherrim shifts from its overcast form, which is small and closed, to its sunshine form, which blooms openly with warm colors and a different appearance. Both forms are real, both are accessible in ordinary play, and both represent the same Pokémon in different states, determined by the weather the player maintains in the battle environment. But in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, these games that introduce Cherim and its dual forms, only one of those forms is visible in the Pokédex. The Overcast form is there, cataloged and viewable in the way every Pokémon is cataloged in the game's encyclopedia. The Sunshine form, the opened, blooming, brighter version that appears during harsh sunlight, cannot be viewed in the Pokédex from within those games. It is the only alternate form of any Pokémon in the franchise to carry this restriction in its generation of introduction. This is not a technical failure or an oversight that creates a gap in the Pokédex by accident. It is a built-in limitation that reflects how the Sunshine form was treated in the design of those specific titles. The form exists. Players can see it during battles when they maintain the right weather conditions. But the game's internal encyclopedia declines to display it in a static, viewable entry, as if acknowledging that the Sunshine form belongs specifically to the moment of sunlight, rather than to any permanent record. The detail is small enough that many players who owned Diamond or Pearl or Platinum and who battled with Cherim in sunlight still never thought to check whether the form appeared in their Pokédex. It requires a specific kind of curiosity to notice the absence of something, and most players were occupied with the form itself rather than with whether it had been formally entered into their records. The starters are among the most analyzed Pokémon in any given generation. Players debate their designs, their type matchups, their final evolutions, their competitive utility. The choice of starter is one of the first meaningful decisions a player makes in any new game, and it carries emotional weight that most other choices in those games do not. Among all the starters ever introduced, one statistic has been quietly accumulating across 9 generations that most players have never tallied. Scaladirge, the final evolution of the fire-type starter Fuecoco from Generation 9, is the heaviest starter Pokémon ever designed. It weighs in at 326.5 kilograms. In pounds, that figure sits at approximately 719.8. Among every starter ever released, among every final evolution and every middle stage and every beginning form across all 9 generations, no starter weighs more than this large, singing, fire and ghost-type crocodilian from Paldea. What makes this detail sit interestingly is how it contradicts the visual assumption a player might form on first seeing Scaladirge. It is large, certainly, but it does not read as the densest or heaviest thing in its generation in an obvious way. Its weight is a piece of data that lives in the Pokédex entry, available to any player who thinks to check the physical specifications section of the entry rather than skimming past it on the way to the flavor text. Weight and height statistics in the Pokédex are the kinds of details that reward long-term comparisons rather than in-the-moment observations. A player who has moved through 9 generations and carries the accumulated weight data of hundreds of starter Pokémon in mind is the player who notices when a single entry breaks every previous record. Most players simply meet Scaladirge, learn its type and its moves, and continue without pausing on the number that places it at the very top of a category no one was necessarily tracking. Hisuian Avalugg presents an interesting case study in how canonical scale gets communicated in the Pokémon franchise. Avalugg itself is already notable for its size, a large ice type whose body resembles a flat iceberg, whose presence in a team feels substantial. The Hisuian form, introduced in Legends Arceus, adds the rock type to its ice typing and gives it a different texture. But the detail that is most surprising appears not in the Pokédex entry, but in the dialogue of a specific character. Volo, one of the figures the player interacts with across the story of Legends Arceus, makes a statement about Hisuian Avalugg that places the creature in a scale category that most players would not have anticipated. He states that these Pokemon could grow up to 30 meters in length. 30 meters. That figure positions the largest possible Hisuian Avalugg as comparable in size to some of the Gigantamax forms introduced in Sword and Shield, Pokemon that were already understood to be phenomenally, sometimes absurdly large. A creature from a historical region of Sinnoh, moving through the frozen highlands of Hisui, could reach dimensions that rival forms that were explicitly built around the concept of impossible enlargement. This piece of lore sits in a single line of character dialogue rather than in a formal Pokédex entry, which is part of what makes it easy to miss. A player moving quickly through Volo's conversations, taking in the story at a pace that prioritizes the next objective, would absorb the information without necessarily registering the number attached to it. But the number is there, canonical and specific, in the text of a game that is already set apart from the main series by its structure and its tone. The idea of an ancient region where Pokemon reached sizes that later generations would not see outside of extraordinary transformation events adds something to the mythology of Hisui that is quietly magnificent. The world was different then. The creatures in it were different, and some of them were 30 meters long on a Tuesday. The Registeel situation within the legendary giant group is one of those statistical anomalies that rewards the player who finds it and then sits with it long enough to understand what it means. The 5 legendary giants, the Regis, form a group that is visually and thematically cohesive. Regirock, Regis, Registeel, and then Regidrago and Regieleki introduced in later games. They share a design language, a set of related discovery conditions, a place in the lore of their respective regions. From the outside, they read as a unified family of similar creatures. But when a player looks at the base stat totals of the original 3, something specific emerges. Regirock and Regis each have a base stat of 200 in their defining defensive category, 200 in defense for Regirock, and 200 in special defense for Regis. Registeel has high defense and high special defense, both significant, but neither of them sits at 200. Registeel is the only one of the 5 legendary giants that does not carry a base stat of that value anywhere in its profile. This is the kind of detail that players who study base stats closely and compare them across related groups will eventually encounter. It is not an obvious asymmetry, not one that affects how Registeel performs in battle or how it feels to train. Registeel is still a genuinely good Pokemon with a useful defensive profile, but within the elegant internal logic that base stat distribution creates, this small departure from the pattern the other 2 original Ridges establish is there, visible and specific for the player who goes looking. The Regi group is defined by pattern. Their designs follow rules, their locations follow rules, their lore follows rules. The small violation of the stat pattern in Registeel does not break the group, but it introduces a quiet asymmetry into something that seems, at first glance, to be perfectly symmetrical. Nurse Joy is one of the most consistent presences in the Pokémon franchise, appearing in nearly every Pokémon Center across every region, always in the same uniform, always ready to restore the player's party to full health. Her name has been part of the franchise from the very beginning, and it reads in English as something pleasant and perhaps slightly on the nose, a name that sounds like it was chosen to communicate warmth and care and medical assistance all at once. But the name did not begin in English. Like so many elements of the franchise, it originated in Japanese, and in Japanese its meaning is more specific and more interesting than the English reading suggests. The Japanese word from which the name derives rendered in translation, means female doctor. Not nurse in the English sense, not a character defined by being helpful and approachable, but a medical professional defined by both her role and her identity. The English localization shifted the name into something that felt like a cheerful coincidence, a name that sounds like it enjoys what it does. The Japanese original was more direct. This kind of translation history is present throughout the franchise in ways that are difficult to notice without deliberately looking for them. Names that seem decorative or playful in English often carry different weights in the source language. Characters who seem like simple archetypes in localization sometimes have more specific meanings in the context from which they were drawn. Nurse Joy is one of the most commonly encountered examples of this, precisely because she is present in every region and every generation, a fixture so familiar that her name stopped being something players thought about and became simply part of the landscape. The gap between what a name means and what it sounds like is a small window into the process by which games travel across languages and cultures and become new versions of themselves without entirely losing what they were before. Tate and Liza hold a distinction in the franchise that no other gym leader duo shares. The twins who run the Moss Deep City Gym in the Hoenn region were the first gym leaders ever to challenge the player to a double battle as the format of the gym challenge itself. When a player walks through Moss Deep City and enters their gym and reaches the leader battle, they are asked to field 2 Pokémon simultaneously against 2 Pokémon from 2 leaders working in coordination. The format itself is the challenge. This had never happened in a core series gym before Tate and Liza introduced it. It is a design choice that required the double battle mechanic to exist, which meant it could not have appeared in Generation 1 or 2, where double battles were not part of the game's structure. But even when double battles arrived, they remained for a time something players encountered in optional contexts or in battles outside the gym structure. Tate and Liza made the format the official challenge of a gym leader encounter. They also remain, to this day, the only official gym leader duo in the entire franchise. Other gym leaders have their own personalities and their own type specialties and their own quirks of design. But the coordination of 2 leaders challenging a player simultaneously as an official gym challenge in a core series game has not been repeated. What was introduced as a new idea remained singular. This makes Tate and Liza occupy a category of one in the franchise's history, which is a quiet form of fame that exists independent of how well remembered they are individually. Players who struggled with their coordinated psychic assault, or who found them relatively easy to clear with the right preparation, may not think of them as particularly landmark figures. But within the organizational history of the Gym Challenge format, they mark something new that no one else has since joined them in doing. Ditto and Mewtwo share something that is not immediately obvious from their designs or their lore or their competitive roles. On the surface, they are very different Pokémon. Mewtwo is one of the most powerful legendaries in the franchise, a creature of enormous significance to the story of the original games, a figure whose relationship to humanity and to its own creation forms one of the central emotional threads of the first generation. Ditto is a small, amorphous, normal type whose most remarkable quality is its ability to transform into any other Pokémon it faces. But in the games from Generation 1 through Sun and Moon, there is a geographical pattern that connects them. Wherever Mewtwo can be found, Ditto can also be found nearby in the wild. The caves and areas that contain Mewtwo as an encounter reliably also contain Ditto among the wild Pokémon that appear in the same location. This is consistent enough across multiple games to suggest intentionality rather than coincidence. The most commonly offered explanation for this distribution draws on Mewtwo's origin. Mewtwo was created through genetic experimentation on Mew, a process involving extensive manipulation of biological material. Ditto is a Pokémon that can transform perfectly into any other creature it encounters, a flexibility of form that suggests its own biology is unusually malleable. The implication that some players and researchers have drawn from these two facts, placed alongside each other, is that the Ditto found near Mewtwo may be failed or incomplete experiments from the same research that produced Mewtwo, creatures that inherited the capacity to take any shape but not the specific shape that the scientists intended. This is not stated anywhere in official lore. It is an inference built from geography and game design. But it is the kind of inference that the franchise seems to invite, the kind of connection that exists in the space between what the games say and what the games arrange. In Diamond and Pearl and Platinum, Rotom is encountered in the old chateau in Eterna Forest. The encounter itself is unusual, involving a specific time of night and a specific television set that a player must interact with in a particular way. There is already something deliberately strange about how Rotom is found, something that sets it apart from walking through tall grass and encountering whatever appears. The old chateau has its own atmosphere, its own history, its own ghost-type Pokémon moving through its halls. But there is another layer of strangeness built into the Rotom encounter that players heard before they saw. When Rotom appears, it does not play the standard wild battle theme that accompanies encounters with regular Pokémon. Instead, it plays the legendary encounter theme, the music reserved for Dialga and Palkia, and the other legendary Pokémon of Sinnoh. The same haunting, significant music that tells the player they are about to face something exceptional plays when a small electric ghost type comes out of a television. The explanation that emerged from examination of the game's code is that this was not intentional. The legendary encounter music was playing for Rotom because its music file in the game's data had been accidentally swapped with the music file belonging to Cresselia, the lunar legendary that roams Sinnoh, after a specific event. Cresselia ended up using the standard wild music. Rotom ended up using the legendary theme. Someone made an error, and it shipped with the game, and players encountered Rotom to the sound of music that told them something momentous was happening. What is interesting about this particular mistake is how well it accidentally fit. Rotom is not a legendary Pokémon in any official classification, but its lore has always positioned it as something unusual and significant. The legendary encounter music made the old chateau television feel even more charged, more important. An accident created an atmosphere that suited the moment, even if it did not belong to the creature that triggered it. Zygarde can be found in Pokémon X and Y, in a location that carries an English name and a collection of other language names that are different, and the difference between them reveals something about how the designers were thinking when they placed this particular legendary creature in this particular cave. In English, the location is called Terminus Cave. A terminus is an endpoint, a final station, the place where a line of travel concludes. The name positions the cave as the end of something. In other language versions of the game, the location is called the Omega Cave. The last letter of the Greek alphabet is Omega. The last letter of the Latin alphabet is Zes, and Zygarde's name begins with that letter. The letter Zid has always been associated with Zygarde in ways that were made more explicit in later games and media, but even here in X and Y, the association was built into the location's name in the versions that use the word omega, the Greek letter of endings, as a reflection of the Latin letter that also marks an ending. The English name keeps the meaning while losing the elegance of the reference. Terminus communicates ending without the resonance of omega, without the connection to how the two alphabets close on the same conceptual note. Players in regions where the cave was called Omega Cave were receiving a different kind of information about where they were and who they were about to encounter. A clue built from alphabets rather than from any explicit statement. This is one of many places where different localizations of the franchise contain different pieces of meaning, where a player who encountered the game in one language received one set of associations and a player in another language received another. The franchise has always been global, and the experience of it has always been, in subtle ways, different depending on which language a player first encountered it in. The move Memento is one of those attacks whose mechanical description is clear enough to understand without difficulty. The user faints. In exchange for that sacrifice, the opposing Pokémon has its attack and special attack sharply lowered. It is a move of strategic self-destruction, a way of buying safety for whatever Pokémon switches in after the sacrifice has been made. Players who use it in competitive contexts understand its value. Players who encountered it in the main story probably thought of it as a curiosity. But the name of the move, laid alongside a piece of Latin that predates the franchise by several centuries, transforms the mechanical description into something that was clearly chosen with intention. Memento mori is a Latin phrase meaning remember that you must die. It is the kind of phrase that appears in philosophical and artistic contexts, a reminder of mortality built into two words. The move Memento takes the first word of that phrase and carries all of its weight with it. A Pokémon that uses Memento is a Pokémon enacting the most literal possible version of the phrase. It remembers that it must die, and it does. This kind of naming precision is present throughout the franchise's move design, but it is rarely as complete as it is here. Memento is not named for a concept that resembles death. It is not a metaphor for sacrifice that might be read multiple ways. It is the direct first word of a two-word Latin reminder of mortality, applied to a move whose entire function is the voluntary death of the user. A player who knows the Latin phrase hears the move name differently. The mechanic does not change. The numbers do not change. But the texture of the choice to use Memento shifts when its name is understood to be not decorative, but definitional. The Enigma berry carries a name that already signals something unusual. An enigma is a puzzle, a mystery, something that resists simple explanation. The item is already positioned as something that does not announce its nature clearly, but there is a visual detail built into the official artwork for the Enigma berry that most players who picked the item up and used it never thought to examine, because why would anyone look closely at the artwork for a berry? On the surface of the Enigma berry, drawn into the design of the item's visual representation, is a question mark, not implied by the shape or suggested by the color or metaphorically present in the name alone. An actual question mark, drawn as a feature of the berry itself, sitting there in the artwork for anyone who looks at the image with sufficient attention to notice it. This is a joke hidden in plain sight, or perhaps a design choice that is simultaneously decorative and meaningful. The Enigma berry is mysterious. Its name says so, and then the artwork says so again, more directly, with a question mark drawn into its surface, as though the berry itself is asking what it is. A player who learned this and went back to look at the item's image in the game's data would find it there, exactly as described, patient and silent and waiting for someone to stop and look. Details like this exist throughout the franchise in ways that are inaccessible to ordinary play without the knowledge that they are there. The Enigma berry's question mark is not something a player sees clearly on the small sprite that represents the item in the bag or in the field. It lives in the larger, higher resolution artwork that official materials use, visible when that artwork is examined with care. In gold and silver, The trainer classes that populate the Johto routes each have an AI assigned to them that governs how their Pokémon select moves in battle. The AI for most trainers is at least partially logical, making choices that reflect some understanding of type matchups, of move effectiveness, of the basic strategic considerations that any knowledgeable trainer would apply. Some AI is more sophisticated than others, but across the Johto experience, most trainer classes make decisions that reflect a kind of intentional engagement with the battle. The Twins trainer class does not. When a player faces a pair of young trainers belonging to this class, the moves their Pokémon select are chosen at the same level of randomness that the game applies to wild Pokémon. There is no logic. There is no type consideration. The AI selects moves as though it is an untrained animal acting on impulse rather than a trainer making a strategic choice. In a game where every other trainer class has been assigned some degree of intentionality in its battle behavior, the Twins select moves at random. This is presumably a design choice rather than an error, a way of communicating through mechanics that these are very young trainers who have not yet developed the understanding of battle strategy that older and more experienced trainers possess. The randomness is not a flaw in how the AI was written. It is the AI behaving correctly according to what it was asked to do, which is to produce the behavior of a trainer who does not yet know what they are doing. The result is a piece of game design that communicates character through the mechanics of how a class engages with the battle system. The Twins are young. They are trying. They are selecting moves the way a child might select moves when first introduced to the game, without the accumulated understanding that turns battle into something strategic. Their randomness is a portrait of inexperience built into the code. Translation is one of the forces that transforms the franchise as it moves across languages, and most players who encounter Pokémon in their native language encounter it as though the names are simply the names, as though Bulbasaur was always Bulbasaur, and Pikachu was always Pikachu, and every other creature always bore the name the player knows it by. But the franchise exists in many languages, and the translation work that carries it between them occasionally produces results that are genuinely surprising. Beldum is a steel and psychic type Pokémon, a small, hovering creature with a single red eye and a body that moves through magnetism rather than through any limb structure. In most languages, Beldum is called something adjacent to Beldum, a name that references bell and dumbbell and carries the creature's visual identity in its sounds. But in Korean, the name assigned to Beldum is Metang, not a variation or a phonetic rendering. The same name that belongs in most languages to Metang, Beldum's direct evolution. A Korean player using Beldum is using a Pokémon whose name belongs, in most of the rest of the world, to the next stage of its evolutionary line. A Korean player using Metang is using a Pokémon called by a name that is not the name that Metang carries in Japanese or English or most other localizations. The evolutionary line moves forward in mechanics, while the names shift in a way that creates a different relationship between stage and identity than players in other regions experience. This is the kind of translation decision that surfaces when localizations operate with some degree of independence, when the teams working on different language versions make choices that fit their language and their audience, without necessarily coordinating perfectly with every other version. The result is a franchise that is slightly different in each language it inhabits, carrying the same creatures through different names toward the same destinations. Golurk is a ghost and ground type Pokémon whose design references ancient golem traditions, the figures of stone and clay brought to motion by inscription and will. Its Pokédex entries describe it as sealed by a magical symbol that keeps its energy from running out of control, as something that has been maintained in sealed form across vast stretches of time. Its visual profile is imposing and stone-heavy, the kind of creature that seems like it would move with deliberate slowness and remain permanently connected to the earth. Golurk can learn Fly, the move that requires a Pokémon to ascend into the air, carry a trainer across a geographical distance, and land at a destination, a move whose visual logic demands something light and airborne. Golurk weighs 330 kilograms. It has no visible wings. Its design is not aerodynamic in any way that the word aerodynamic might ordinarily be applied, and yet the move is in its learned move list, and it works in gameplay. The explanation for this particular design choice reaches into the anime rather than into the game's own internal lore. In a film connected to the anime, Golurk was depicted as capable of flight by transforming its lower section into rocket boosters, jettisoning the leg structures and producing thrust from below, ascending not through wings or gliding, but through propulsion. The film established the precedent. The games honored the precedent by making Fly learnable. This is one of the cleaner examples of cross-media continuity in the franchise, a moment where something the anime explored became something the games incorporated rather than leaving the two continuities to develop separately. Golurk's ability to fly is strange, and it is also completely explained if the player knows where to look for the explanation. Torterra carries in its Platinum Pokédex entry, a statement that is presented in the same matter-of-fact tone that every Pokédex entry uses, and the flatness of the delivery is part of what makes the content of the entry feel remarkable when attention is brought to it. The entry states that some small Pokémon are born on a Torterra's back and spend their entire lives there, not visiting, not sheltering temporarily, living their entire lives on the terrain formed by another creature's body. This is one of the most complete expressions of Torterra's ecological concept in any official text. The creature's design is built around the idea of a living landscape, a Pokémon whose shell-like back has become a genuine ecosystem over time, growing trees and grass and supporting life the way a landmass does. The Pokédex entries across games describe Torterra as a creature that has been moving slowly through terrain while the terrain on its back grows and changes. Small Pokémon take shelter there, but the Platinum entry goes further than shelter. It says born and lived, not visited and departed, an entire life cycle from arrival to conclusion occurring on the moving island of another creature's back. The Pokémon living there would never know that the ground beneath them breathes, that the hills they rest in are the ridges of a spine, that the trees they shelter under grow from the shell of something alive. This is the kind of entry that rewards the player who reads it slowly and follows the implications through. A Torterra moving through the wild is carrying a world. The creatures on that world may never see beyond it. The Pokédex says so in that plain voice it uses for everything, and then moves on to the next entry. The move Focus Energy exists in the game with a description that promises exactly what its name suggests. A Pokémon that uses it is focusing its energy, preparing itself for a critical hit, positioning itself for a strike that will land with unusual force. In competitive and casual play alike, moves that boost critical hit rates are valuable, because critical hits ignore certain defensive stat changes and land with increased damage. A move that improves the odds of one occurring should be beneficial. In Generation 1, Focus Energy does not work the way its description says it works. Because of a coding error in the original games, a Pokémon that uses Focus Energy does not have its critical hit ratio increased. Instead, the ratio is divided by 4. The move that was intended to make critical hits more likely makes them dramatically less likely. A player who uses Focus Energy in the original games and then expects to see more critical hits is in fact watching their chances drop to a fraction of where they started. The error went out with the games and existed in every version of Generation 1 without correction. Players who noticed that critical hits seemed rarer after using focus energy may have attributed it to bad luck. The variance in when critical hits occur makes it difficult to notice a pattern change unless the sample size is very large. The actual cause, the division by 4 rather than multiplication, was something that had to be discovered through code examination rather than through play experience. Generation 1 contains a number of mechanical errors and oversights of this kind, places where the game's code did not produce the behavior the design intended. Focus energy is among the most significant of these, because it inverts the function of a move rather than simply failing to apply an effect correctly. Pony Island is the fourth of the 4 islands that make up the Alala region in Sun and Moon. The other 3 islands are each divided by numbered routes, the standard organizational structure that carries players through a region by giving each stretch of path a number and a designation. Routes provide a sense of organized geography, a map that a player can read and reference. They are the scaffold that most regions in the franchise are built around. Pony Island has no numbered routes. It is the only island in all of Alola that the game does not divide by that organizational structure. A player moves through Pony Island through named locations and distinctive landmarks, rather than through a sequence of numbered paths. Vast Pony Canyon, the Ruins of Hope, Pony Wilds, Pony Grove, the Altar of the Sun or Moon. These are the navigational markers for Pony Island, rather than the numbered sequence that players were accustomed to from the other 3 islands and from every previous generation of the franchise. The absence of numbered routes on Pony Island gives the island a different quality during play. It is the most remote and least developed of the 4 in terms of human presence, and the lack of numbered routes reflects that, since there is no Route 17 on Pony Island because no one got around to formally designating the paths there. The wild spaces have names, but not the kind of administrative organization that routes imply. This is a geographic and design detail that most players absorbed as atmosphere without thinking about what was missing. The island felt different, felt more open and wild. Part of what created that feeling was the absence of something that every other part of the region included, an absence so structurally embedded that it shaped the experience without calling attention to itself. The Dark type arrived in Generation 2, and its introduction was significant. Gold and Silver brought with it the Steel type as well, both of them designed in part to address balance issues that the Psychic type's dominance had created in Generation 1. Dark type moves could hit Psychic type Pokémon for super effective damage. Dark type Pokémon were immune to Psychic type moves entirely. The type was built in part as a counter, and it arrived alongside a set of Pokémon and moves that gave the franchise a different strategic texture. But Dark type gym leaders did not arrive with the Dark type. The generation that introduced the type did not include a gym leader who specialized in it. Neither did Generation 3, nor Generation 4, nor Generation 5, nor Generation 6, nor Generation 7. The Dark type was introduced in 1999, and the first Dark type gym leader in the franchise did not appear until Sword and Shield, games released in 2019. 20 years passed between the introduction of the type and the introduction of a gym leader who specialized in it. Piers, the Dark type gym leader of Spikemuth in the Galar region, finally filled a category that had been open for 2 decades. The wait itself is the remarkable fact. 20 years of a type existing without anyone designated as its champion within the gym structure that is one of the franchise's defining organizational features. Every other type had its leaders. Dark type had trainers and rivals, and Elite Four members, and champions, and villains who used it. It did not have a gym leader until the 8th generation. This is the kind of historical gap that is easy to miss because it is defined by an absence. Players were not waiting for the first dark-type gym leader because most players were not keeping track of which types still lacked a representative in that specific role. But the gap was there for 20 years, and then it closed. Cherish balls occupy an unusual position in the mechanics of Pokémon capturing. They are the most visually distinctive of all Pokeball variants, with a red and black design that signals rarity and specialness. They cannot be obtained through ordinary gameplay. They cannot be bought in any shop. They do not appear in the item bag as something a player can acquire through normal means. Their presence in a player's collection signals that the Pokémon inside was received through a special event, an official distribution of some kind. Players who have encountered Cherish Ball Pokémon through events have understood them to be exceptional. The ball itself communicates rarity through its appearance and its unavailability. If something arrives in a Cherish Ball, it was given through official channels and cannot be replicated through normal play. The association between Cherish Ball and something precious and rare is built into every aspect of how the item presents itself. But the catch rate encoded into a Cherish Ball is exactly 1, the same as a standard Pokeball. The catch rate of 1 is the most basic catch rate in the game, the rate applied to the ordinary ball that a player has from the very beginning of their playthrough. All of the visual and contextual rarity of the Cherish Ball exists in its appearance and its distribution method rather than in any mechanical advantage it carries. A Cherish Ball is a standard Pokeball wearing exceptional clothing. Players who discovered this through code examination found that the catch rate figure had been quietly tucked behind all that rarity signaling, making no effort to justify the Cherish Ball's status through mechanics. The specialness of the ball is entirely symbolic, entirely contextual, and entirely real in every sense that matters to a player who received a Pokémon in 1. The fact that the underlying number is 1 changes nothing about what it felt like to receive it. Zarude is a mythical Pokémon from Generation 8, a dark and grass type, introduced through a special distribution tied to the 23rd Pokémon film. It is a creature associated with dense jungle terrain, with vines and foliage, with a protective instinct towards smaller and more vulnerable creatures. Its data form, available through a specific version of the distribution, shows Zarude wearing a cape, a piece of cloth wrapped around it, in a way that has additional significance. On that cape, visible in the artwork and accessible through careful examination of the data form's visual design, is the number 251. This is not a decoration chosen for purely aesthetic reasons. 251 is the national Pokédex number of Celebi, the mythical time-traveling Pokémon whose association with the Ilex forest gives it a specific connection to protective and restorative themes in the franchise's lore. The connection between Zarude and Celebi in the film that accompanied their joint distribution is specific and meaningful within that story, and the cape Zarude wears in the data form carries that connection as a number. A player who knows Celebi's Pokédex number looks at the cape and immediately understands what the number signifies. A player who does not know it sees a piece of cloth with a number that seems arbitrary until the context arrives. This is a piece of visual storytelling that requires cross-reference to fully decode, that sits at the intersection of the game and its associated media and expects a player who has followed both. The franchise has always operated this way in some capacity, leaving details in one location that can only be fully understood by someone who has encountered something in another. The names of core series Pokémon games follow patterns that players learn to expect. A version name, sometimes a color, sometimes a material, or a concept or a celestial body, usually 2 to 4 words at most, compact and direct. The titles are recognizable and functional. They communicate what generation the game belongs to and which of the paired versions it represents without excess. But Pokémon Yellow carries a full official title that breaks the compact pattern more dramatically than any other core series game in the franchise's history. The complete title is Pokémon Yellow Special Pikachu Edition. Spelled out and counted, that title contains exactly 30 characters. No other core series main game in the franchise has a title of that length. Red, Blue, Gold, Silver, Ruby, Sapphire, Diamond, Pearl, Black, White, XY, Sun, Moon, Sword, Shield, Scarlet, Violet, and all the iterations between them. None of their full official titles reach 30 characters. Yellow's length reflects the moment of its creation. It was released at the height of the first wave of Pokémon's global cultural dominance, in a period when the anime and the games and the trading cards were all simultaneously expanding in the same direction, when Pikachu had become the face of a franchise in a way that no individual creature had been before. The full title acknowledged that moment, honored it, made it part of the name of the game itself. Special Pikachu Edition is not subtle. It is a game that understood exactly what it was in the cultural moment it occupied. The record of longest core series game title has stood since 1998 and has not been approached by any subsequent release. Whether this is because later titles deliberately avoided Yellow's length, or simply because the conditions that produced that length have not recurred, is a question the franchise itself does not answer. Arbok is a poison-type Pokémon whose design is built around the Cobra, with a distinctive pattern on its spread hood that gives it an intimidating appearance and serves as one of its most recognizable visual elements. Players who encountered Arbok across different playthroughs, different generations, different media, may have noticed that the pattern seems to vary without thinking too carefully about why. The Pokédex contains the explanation. Multiple entries confirm that Arbok's hood pattern differs depending on what region the individual Arbok comes from. The franchise presents this as a biological reality about the species, the same way real-world animals in different regions develop different colorations and markings through adaptation and isolation. An Arbok from one part of the world looks different from an Arbok raised in another. The variation is real and documented. What is particularly notable is that this confirmation appears not only in the Pokédex, but also in the official manga connected to the franchise, which depicts Arbok from different regions, bearing different patterns and traits. This is established fact about the creature. The variation is canon across multiple official sources, which gives it a consistency that single-source lore details sometimes lack. This is one of the moments where the franchise reaches towards something like biological realism, toward the idea that creatures in this world are not stamped from uniform templates, but vary the way real animals vary, shaped by the environments they inhabit and the populations they belong to. Arbok's regional variation asks the player to think of the species not as a single standardized creature, but as something that exists in a wider, more varied way across the world. The Pokédex is a mechanic introduced in Gold and Silver and carried through subsequent generations that most players encounter at some point in their journey and receive in the form of a nurse's surprised announcement that their Pokémon is carrying something unusual. The Pokédex is a beneficial virus that doubles the effort values of Pokémon gains from battle, accelerating the stat development process for players who understand the underlying mechanics and want to optimize their team's growth. It is rare, it spreads between Pokémon in the party, and it is one of the more opaque beneficial systems in the franchise. In Scarlet and Violet, the Pokédex is absent. The mechanic does not appear in these games. Pokémon cannot contract or spread it. Nurses do not announce it. The mysterious symbol that appeared in previous games to indicate an active Pokédex infection is not present. The system was quietly removed entirely from this generation. The timing of this removal is something players noticed with a particular kind of recognition. Scarlet and Violet were released in 2022. The years immediately preceding their release had been defined globally by a heightened collective sensitivity to contagious spread, to the mechanics of how something transmissible moves between hosts, to the experience of contact-based transmission in a population, a mechanic built around a beneficial virus that spreads between the creatures in a player's party carries different connotations in that context than it might have carried in a different moment. Whether or not the removal was directly motivated by the sensitivity or by other design considerations is not something Pokémon's developers have formally stated. The timing, however, is specific enough that the connection is difficult to overlook. The Master Ball is the capture item that players work toward and finally receive at a pivotal moment in most Pokémon games. It never fails. That is its entire identity as an item and as a promise made by the franchise to the player who holds one. No Pokémon, legendary or common, shiny or ordinary, will escape a Master Ball once it is thrown. The guarantee is absolute, and it has been absolute since the Master Ball appeared in Generation 1. Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee introduce a specific interaction that lives inside the guarantee without contradicting it. In these games, when a player throws a Master Ball at Mewtwo or at one of the legendary bird Pokémon, the Pokémon does not passively wait for the ball to complete its animation and claim it. Instead, so the legendary reacts. It swats the ball away. The ball bounces back from the deflection, and then it catches the Pokémon anyway. The guarantee holds. The Master Ball works. But the animation adds a moment of apparent resistance, a frame or two where the legendary Pokémon refused and deflected and rejected the throw, before the ball returns and completes its function regardless of that resistance. The legendary did not escape, but the legendary protested. This is a piece of animation design that acknowledges the gap between what a Master Ball does mechanically and what it might feel like to encounter a creature of enormous power and simply throw a ball at it. Well, the legends resist. They protest. And then the ball takes them anyway, exactly as promised. The guarantee unbroken, even as the presentation made room for something that looked like defiance. Pokémon Tetris was released in 2002 as an official title for the Pokémon Mini Console, one of the smallest handheld gaming devices ever produced, and one that saw limited release and is relatively obscure in the wider history of the franchise. It was a genuine crossover with Tetris, one of the most recognizable puzzle game formats in the history of gaming, adapted with Pokémon theming and released for hardware that few players in the wider audience had ever held. The existence of this game is one of those franchise facts that disappears easily because the platform it was released on has itself largely disappeared from mainstream awareness. Players who grew up with the Game Boy Advance in the same era may never have encountered a Pokémon Mini Console. The hardware was released in limited regions, had limited software support, and produced limited lasting impression compared to the mainline games being released alongside it, but the crossover was official. Pokémon Tetris was produced and released with full authorization, featuring the falling block gameplay of the Tetris formula, surrounded by Pokémon characters and design elements. In the long list of official Pokémon games and Pokémon media spanning 3 decades, it occupies a specific and largely forgotten coordinate. The obscurity of the Pokémon Mini as a platform has insulated most of its library from general player knowledge. Players who know the franchise deeply, who have followed its full history, including the peripheral hardware and the licensed games and the side projects that existed alongside the main series, know about Pokémon Tetris. Players who know the franchise through the main series alone may have never encountered any reference to it at all. Girafarig is a normal and psychic type Pokémon whose name presents something to any player who pauses long enough to read it in both directions. Girafarig spelled forward is the name. Girafarig spelled backward is also Girafarig. The name is a palindrome, a word that reads identically in both directions. For a Pokémon whose design includes a second head at the end of its tail, a creature that is literally heading in two directions simultaneously, a name that works in both directions, is a piece of design precision that rewards attention. The evolutionary line takes this naming principle forward and changes it. Farigiraf, the evolution introduced in Generation 9, does not have a palindromic name. Instead, Farigiraf is an anagram of Girafarig. The letters are rearranged, the name becomes something new while being constructed entirely from the same components as the original. The evolution of the creature is reflected in the evolution of the name's relationship to itself. These two naming strategies, palindrome and anagram, belong to the same conceptual family without being identical. Both are about a name that contains its own reflection in some form. The palindrome reflects perfectly the same word read from either end. The anagram shuffles the reflection, rearranges it into a new configuration that is recognizably related to the original without reproducing it exactly. Between Girafarig and Farigiraf, the franchise encoded a small lesson about transformation as change rather than reversal. This is a naming detail that most players absorb as a curiosity without following the logic all the way through to what it communicates about how evolutions relate to their pre-evolutions. But the relationship is there, consistent and intentional, built from the letters themselves. Every new core series Pokémon game is expected to bring new items into the franchise. That expectation is built from how the series has consistently worked across nearly every generation. Each new set of games introducing new held items, new berries, new evolutionary materials, new medicines, new tools for navigating the world. Players who move from one generation to the next encounter items they have never seen before, building familiarity with new mechanics through the things they pick up and collect. Two games in the franchise's history introduced no new items at all. The original Japanese Pokémon Blue, a version that was only released in Japan alongside the original Red and Green, contains 0 new items relative to what already existed in those games. Pokémon Yellow, the special Pikachu edition released in Japan in 1998 and internationally in 1999, also introduced 0 new items. Both games sat within the existing item structure of Generation 1 without adding to it. This makes Blue and Yellow unique among the core series games in a way that is easy to overlook, precisely because items are not often the lens through which players evaluate a game's contribution to the franchise. The story added by Yellow is significant. The Pikachu following mechanic is memorable. The alignment with the anime is a defining feature, but in the specific category of item introduction, Yellow is notable for what it did not do rather than for what it added. The fact that two games share this distinction and that they both belong to the same generation suggests something about how Generation 1 managed its item economy and how the variants within that generation were treated as refinements of the original experience rather than expansions of it. Castelia City in the Unova region is one of the densest and most visually elaborate locations in the franchise, a large urban area built around a harbor with tall buildings and specific districts and enough individual details in the buildings and the streets and the people moving through them to support considerable exploration. Players who entered each building and interacted with each character across all of Castelia's blocks found a city that rewarded thoroughness. Among the buildings a player could enter in Castelia City was one that belonged to Game Freak itself. The developers of the Pokémon franchise placed their headquarters inside the world their games create. an office that the player could walk into, that contained characters representing the development team, that acknowledged through its in-world existence that the people who make these games are also, in the fiction of these games, a real entity that exists within the world they designed. This is one of many self-referential moments the franchise has included across its history, the developers inserting themselves or their company into the world of the games in ways that are playful rather than disruptive. The effect is a gentle collapse of the boundary between creator and creation, an acknowledgement within the fiction that there is a fiction made without anything in the games needing to become something other than itself. A player who walked into the Game Freak building in Castalia City and spoke to the characters there was participating in a moment where the game knew it was a game, where the developers allowed themselves to be present within the work, where the distinction between the world being simulated and the world doing the simulating was briefly and warmly acknowledged. Xerneas is one of the two cover legendaries of Pokémon X, a fairy-type creature whose design is built around the symbolism of life and vitality and the cycle of seasons. It is a graceful, deer-like creature whose distinctive antlers glow with color in specific context and whose presence in the game's story is connected to the themes of preservation and continuation that the narrative explores. It is a visually striking Pokémon in either of the two states it occupies. Those two states carry a distinction that players who battled with or against Xerneas in X and Y may not have thought to examine in detail. Xerneas has an active mode and a neutral mode. In active mode, its antlers glow with the rich, colored lights that appear in its promotional artwork and its battle animations, the version that most players hold in mind when they think of Xerneas. In neutral mode, its antlers are pale white, drained of the color that makes active mode distinctive. The shift between these modes is not controlled by the player. Xerneas enters active mode when it enters battle and returns to neutral mode outside of battle. A player who places Xerneas in their party and then walks through the overworld is walking with a pale antlered Xerneas rather than the glowing one. The glowing form belongs specifically to the battle context, to the moment of engagement. This makes Xerneas unusual among dual-form legendaries, in that its two states are determined by context rather than by held item or move use or weather. The creature itself shifts between its forms depending on whether it is in a situation that calls for its full expression of power or simply moving through the world in a resting state. The game treats the distinction as biological rather than mechanical. Heart Gold and Soul Silver are remakes that expanded on Gold and Silver in many ways, deepening the Johto experience and adding features that the original games could not support. The remakes are filled with details that reward players who explored them thoroughly, who spoke to every character and tried every interaction and paid attention to the small moments that surrounded the larger narrative. Among these small moments is one that involves the rival, whose name the player is asked to choose at the beginning of the game, the way most rival names are player assigned in the franchise. A player who types a name before starting is giving the rival an identity that will persist across the entire playthrough. But what happens if the player leaves the name field entirely blank and presses enter without entering any text is something that most players never thought to try. The game has a response prepared for this specific case. Rather than accepting a blank name or producing an error, Heart Gold and Soul Silver suggest a name automatically. In Heart Gold, the suggested name is Heart. In Soul Silver, the suggested name is Soul. The names of the games themselves suggested to the player for the rival who will travel alongside them through a region named for Gold and Silver, carrying version-specific names that tie the rival's identity directly to the game the player is holding. This is a small design consideration that required someone to think through the case of the blank name field and decided to do something meaningful with it, rather than simply rejecting the input or assigning a default. The result is a moment of unexpected elegance and a menu interaction, the kind of detail that lives in the margins of the experience and rewards the player who discovers it by accident or by deliberate curiosity. Cresselia and Rotom occupy the inverse of each other in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum in a way that is small, specific, and almost certainly the result of the coding error already noted, but which deserves attention for what it communicates about the relationship between music and expectation in the franchise. Cresselia is a legendary Pokémon, one of the floating, crescent-shaped lunar creatures that roam Sinnoh and can be tracked and encountered through a specific storyline event. When a player finally corners Cresselia and begins the battle, the music that plays is the standard wild battle theme, the same music that accompanies encounters with ordinary wild Pokémon on routes throughout the region. A legendary Pokémon arriving to standard wild music creates a specific atmospheric experience. The player has done the work of tracking Cresselia, following the event, chasing a creature that flees when encountered, going through the journey that a roaming legendary requires. And then, when the encounter finally begins, the music does not signal that something special is happening. It signals a routine encounter in the tall grass. Rotom, on the other hand, a Pokémon that is not classified as legendary, arrives in the old chateau to the legendary encounter theme, as established earlier. The two Pokémon received each other's music through an error, and the result was a pair of experiences that each feel slightly misaligned with what the player might expect. What is interesting about this misalignment is how much the music shapes the player's sense of what they are facing. A battle that opens with the legendary theme feels different from a battle that opens with the standard wild theme, even if the mechanics of the encounter are identical. The mistake produced two small distortions in the emotional texture of the game, each one pushing the player's experience slightly in the wrong direction from what the design intended. The Ice type has been present since Generation 1, native to the earliest games, represented by Pokémon like Jinx and Lapras and Dugong that players encountered across the original Kanto journey. It is one of the types that most players would not think of as having arrived late to anything, because it was simply there, present from the beginning, a fixed part of the franchise's type system from the moment that type system was introduced. But the pure Ice-type Pokémon, a Pokémon with Ice as its only typing, rather than as part of a dual-type combination, did not appear until Generation 3. Snorunt was the first pure Ice-type Pokémon, introduced in Ruby and Sapphire. The Pokémon that represented the Ice-type in Generations 1 and 2 were all dual-typed, carrying Water or Psychic or Normal alongside the Ice. Jinx is Ice and Psychic. Lapras is Water and Ice. Dugong is Water and Ice. Cloyster is Water and Ice. Articuno is Ice and Flying. The type existed for 2 full generations, without a single Pokémon being purely that type. This is not immediately obvious, because those dual-type Pokémon were visually and thematically associated with Ice, identified by most players as Ice-type creatures without any conscious awareness of the secondary typing that completed their classification. The pure type arrived later quietly, with Snorunt in a generation that was otherwise focused on the tropical and volcanic world of Hoenn, not on ice and snow. This is one of those type history details that reveals something about how the franchise's roster was assembled across generations, about which categories had gaps, and when those gaps were filled, about the way the type system's representation has been gradually completed and expanded across the franchise's lifetime. The Bug type is the only primary type in the franchise that does not have a legendary Pokémon that belongs to it, without also being a mythical or a form changer. This is a fact that requires precision in how it is stated, because it involves categories that overlap and conditions that must be held clearly in mind. Mythical Pokémon, while legendary in a colloquial sense, belong to a separate official classification. Form-changing Pokémon that shift into a bug-type secondary, but are not primarily bug, do not fill the gap. When those categories are set aside, no legendary Pokémon of the standard legendary classification belongs to the bug type. This is notable given how old and populous the bug type is. Bug-type Pokémon have been part of the franchise since Generation 1. They are among the most commonly encountered types in the early roots of most games. They have representatives across every generation. The type is familiar and well represented in the overall roster. But the legendary tier, the Pokémon that inhabit that specific classification in their region's mythology, has not included a bug-type representative in any generation of the franchise. Genesect is a mythical, not a standard legendary. Shedinja is a ghost type that emerged from Ninjask's shed shell. Buzzwole and Pheromosa are ultra beasts, a separate classification. Golisopod and Vikavolt are not legendary. The gap persists across every generation, every legendary trio and duo and quadruplet, every mythical event distribution. No bug-type legendary in the standard classification. Whether this gap will be filled in future generations is something the franchise has not addressed, but its persistence across 9 generations is specific enough that it has become its own kind of notable fact. The absence defined precisely enough to communicate something about how the legendary tier was assembled. Spectrier is the ghost-type legendary horse introduced in the Crown Tundra expansion for Sword and Shield, connected to Calyrex through a fusion mechanic that allows the two to merge and Calyrex to ride it. Its design is minimal and striking, entirely dark with glowing details, a creature that reads as fast and threatening in its visual composition. Among all ghost-type Pokémon in the franchise, Spectrier carries a specific numerical distinction. Spectrier has the highest base speed stat of any ghost-type Pokémon in the franchise, a 130 in speed, a figure that places it in the highest tier of speed statistics across the entire game and positions it as one of the fastest creatures in any context rather than merely the fastest ghost type. Its offensive profile is also strong, but speed is the defining number for Spectrier in terms of how it occupies its category. Beyond that statistical record, Spectrier holds another distinction that is rarer and more specific. It is the only Pokémon in the franchise that can be caught while it is currently fused with another Pokémon. The fusion between Calyrex and Spectrier creates a combined form called Ice Rider or Shadow Rider Calyrex, depending on which horse is involved. To add Spectrier to the Pokédex, a player must encounter and interact with the fused form and complete a process that results in the fusion being separated. The Spectrier that is added to the player's party comes from a state of being not fully itself, from a form that was the merged version of two different creatures. This makes the act of catching Spectrier unlike the act of catching most Pokémon, a process with an additional layer of interaction before the standard capture can occur. Santaloon Forest is the first forested area that players encounter in the Kalos region, a gentle wooded space early in the game that introduces the feel of outdoor exploration and contains the kind of Pokémon and trainers that early routes typically feature. Players who were beginning their first playthrough of X or Y moved through Santaloon Forest in the natural course of the early game, learning the layout and building familiarity with the area. Players who carried significant previous experience with the franchise into their Kalos playthrough encountered Santaloon Forest differently, because the layout of Santaloon Forest is an exact reproduction of the layout of Viridian Forest from the Kanto region, not a loose reference or a visual homage, an exact copy, path for path, in terms of the forest's navigable structure, Viridian Forest appears in Pokémon Red and Blue and Yellow, the very first generation of the main series games. A forest early in the Kanto journey that contained certain Pokémon and certain trainers, in a specific layout that players of those games walked through enough times to internalize. Decades later, in Generation 6, a player who knew the old forest and entered the new one would find the same turns in the same places, the same basic map reproduced in a different region with different Pokémon and a different visual style. This is a deliberate callback placed in the geography of the Kalos region, a gift to long-term players who would recognize the shape of the space they were moving through. A new player experiences Santaloon Forest as simply the first forest of their journey. A veteran experiences it as a memory. The Spear Pillar in Sinnoh is one of the most significant locations in the Diamond and Pearl narrative, the elevated ruin at the summit of Mount Coronet, where the player's journey reaches its climactic confrontation and where the legendary Pokémon associated with space and time can be encountered. It is an outdoor location, open to the sky, dramatic in its visual design and its placement within the mountain's geography. Players who wanted to leave the Spear Pillar after arriving discovered that the usual method for leaving an outdoor location was unavailable. Fly could not be used. The move that normally allows a player to depart from any outdoor location to any previously visited city or town did not function on the Spear Pillar. The game prevents the player from using Fly to exit the area. There is no explanation given for this restriction in the game's text. The Spear Pillar is a location where the fabric of space and time has been disrupted, where legendary forces have been summoned, and where the normal rules of the world were destabilized by events that the player intervened in. Within that lore context, a location where space itself has been warped is a plausible place for certain forms of spatial movement to be unreliable or unavailable. Whether this was the designer's reasoning for building the restriction into the code, or whether the restriction serves a narrative function of keeping the player in the area until they have completed what needs to be completed, there is something the game does not say. The restriction is simply present, a quiet wall around a location that already carries the weight of the game's most significant events. Of all the starter Pokémon ever introduced across every generation of the franchise, 2 begin their journey with dual typing rather than with a single type. Most starters arrive as a pure representative of their type category, a fire type, a water type, or a grass type, gaining additional typings through their evolution line if the design calls for it. The starting point is usually single. Bulbasaur from Generation 1 and Rowlet from Generation 7 are the exceptions. Both begin as dual-type Pokémon, and both share the grass type as one of their 2 typings. Bulbasaur is grass and poison. Rowlet is grass and flying. The shared grass type between the only 2 dual-type starters in franchise history is a detail that becomes noticeable only when the whole population of starters is considered together and the category of dual-type beginners is counted. Bulbasaur and Rowlet are separated by 6 generations and significant design evolution. They do not share a visual language or a thematic approach. One is a small quadrupedal creature with a bulb on its back, the other a small round owl with a leaf bow tie. Their designs communicate different things about the franchise in different moments of its development, but the specific category they share, starter Pokémon that begin dual-typed, is one they occupy together and alone. Whether this is intentional design that deliberately avoids diluting the type identity of most starters by keeping their introductory forms single-typed, or whether it reflects changing decisions about individual Pokémon rather than a systematic policy, is not something the designers have addressed directly. The pattern is there regardless of the reasoning behind it. Zacian and Zamazenta are the version legendaries of Sword and Shield, massive wolf-like creatures whose designs are built around weapons and shields, whose lore connects them to the history of the Galar region and to a specific ancient conflict that shaped what the region became. They are large, imposing, heavily designed Pokémon whose identities are built around martial imagery. Within the game's official Pokédex classification, both Zacian and Zamazenta share the same category name. They are both officially called the warrior Pokémon. The Pokédex assigns category names to every Pokémon, names that appear in the summary screen and are generally overlooked by most players in favor of the more detailed flavor text that appears below. But the category names are official designations, part of the game's formal language about what each Pokémon is. Warrior Pokémon is a category that suits both creatures perfectly in a way that feels obvious once it is pointed out. They are built around weapons and warfare, around the imagery of ancient conflict, around a history that positions them as participants in battles that shaped the world they inhabit. The category name is not a surprise. It is precise. But precision and expectedness are not the same as noticeability, and most players who owned Sword or Shield never looked at the summary screen long enough to read what the game officially called these creatures. The category name confirms what the designs communicate, which is that Zacian and Zamazenta are not simply wolf Pokémon or legendary Pokémon or fairy and fighting type Pokémon. They are, according to the game's own formal classification, warriors. Generation 5 brought more distinct legendary groupings to a single pair of games than any other generation in the franchise's history. Black and White introduced the Tau Trio, Reshiram, Zekrom, and Kyurem, three dragons connected by the lore of truth and ideals, and what is left when those qualities are absent. They introduced the Swords of Justice, Cobalion, Terrakion, Varishan, and Keldeo, legendary Pokémon modeled on the Three Musketeers, extended to 4. They introduced the Forces of Nature, Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus, 3 Pokémon connected to the storms and natural forces that shape the region. 3 separate legendary groups in a single game. No other generation in the main series released a paired version of games that contained 3 fully developed and distinct legendary groupings simultaneously. Some generations have larger total numbers of legendary Pokémon or more mythical distributions, but the specific metric of distinct legendary groups within a single game belongs to Generation 5 in a way that stands apart from every other generation. This density of legendary group design gives Black and White an unusual texture when they are considered as a generation. The lore of Unova is packed with significant Pokémon, each connected to different thematic threads that run through the region's history and mythology. A player who follows the narrative of Black and White closely encounters 3 complete legendary narratives within the same playthrough, each one gesturing toward a different piece of what the region means and where it came from. The franchise has continued to develop legendary Pokémon in subsequent generations, but the structural decision to place 3 complete groups within a single generation has not been repeated. Lance's Dragonite, in the final battle of the original Pokémon Red, Green, and Blue, carries a mechanical anomaly that became one of the more discussed technical curiosities in the history of Generation 1 competitive analysis. Lance is the champion of the Kanto region, a formidable trainer who specializes in Dragon-type Pokémon and who presents the final challenge before a player is recognized as the new champion. His Dragonite is part of a fearsome team. In the battle, his Dragonite uses the move Barrier. Barrier is a psychic-type move that raises the user's defense stat. Dragonite cannot learn Barrier in Generation 1 through any legitimate means. The move is not in its level up list, not available through TM, not accessible through any in-game mechanism that a player can actually use. Lance's Dragonite uses a move that Lance's Dragonite cannot legally know. This makes the Pokémon technically illegal by the franchise's own rules. A Pokémon defined by the moves it can legitimately learn, and validated by the absence of moves that are outside those legitimate channels, would not pass a modern verification check if Lance's Dragonite were submitted through a transfer system. It belongs to a generation before those verification systems existed, a generation where the question of whether a Pokémon was built according to the rules was simply not something the game enforced or checked. The detail is a window into how Generation 1 was assembled, how the Pokémon that trainers used were not necessarily constructed with the same constraints that applied to player-obtained Pokémon, how the rules and the game existed in a relationship that was less tightly bound than later generations would make it. In the anime episode known as An Old Family Blend, which aired as part of the Sinnoh arc, a trainer named Trainers in the episode participates in the Sinnoh League tournament. Among the Pokémon registered by a standard trainer character, one belongs to a category that had never previously appeared on a standard trainer's roster in the anime's history. The trainer uses a Heatran, one of the legendary Pokémon of the Sinnoh region. This was the first time in the anime's broadcast history that a non-special, non-main character trainer used a legendary Pokémon in an official competition context. Legendary Pokémon in the anime had always been positioned as forces above ordinary trainer ownership, creatures that existed at a different scale from the Pokémon that trainers caught and raised and carried in team compositions. They appeared in the stories of the games and the films as significant, powerful, rare entities, rather than as members of competitive teams. The appearance of Heatran in a standard trainer's roster in a league context was a small but genuine departure from the convention the anime had maintained across all previous seasons. The trainer who used it was not a major character, not a villain, not a special case narrative has established as exceptional. It was a tournament participant who happened to have a legendary. Whether this was a deliberate narrative decision to expand the convention or a creative choice made without full awareness of what it established is something the production of the anime has not addressed in any formal statement. But the record exists, and the first time stands as the first time regardless of the intention behind it. Pikachu occupies a special position in the franchise that reflects its status as the most recognizable individual Pokémon in the world and the face of the franchise's identity across media and merchandise and cultural presence. This special position has been reflected mechanically in specific ways across different generations, and one of those mechanical reflections involves the Zem move system introduced in the Sun and Moon games. Zem moves are powerful single-use attacks that a Pokémon can access when it holds the appropriate Zud crystal and its trainer performs the corresponding pose. Most Pokémon that have Zem moves have 1. A single Zud crystal that unlocks a single devastating attack. Some have unique Z moves connected to their signature attacks. But Pikachu, across the Sun and Moon games and their Ultra versions, has access to 2 separate Z moves, 2 different Z crystals, 2 distinct devastating single-use attacks, each connected to a different aspect of Pikachu's identity or its history in the anime. No other Pokémon in the game has access to 2 Z moves. The mechanic was introduced for a wide range of Pokémon, and the distribution of unique Zud crystals was done selectively. The decision to give Pikachu 2 rather than 1 reflects the franchise's understanding of what Pikachu represents and its willingness to honor that representation through a mechanical distinction that no other creature in the game shares. This is one of many ways the franchise has marked Pikachu as existing in a category of 1 within the systems of the games themselves, not simply as a marketing priority or a cultural symbol, but as a Pokémon that the game treats differently from all others. The Alola Pokédex contains heart scales and the explanation for where they come from in certain locations sits quietly in the design of the game's ecology, the way the best Pokémon environmental storytelling always has. But there is a specific beta version discovery connected to a Pokémon from an entirely different generation that reveals something about how designs evolve across the creative process. The beta version of Pokémon Gold and Silver from 1997, before those games were finalized and released, contained a version of Octillery that no player who purchased the finished games ever encountered. In the beta, Octillery was depicted wearing a metal helmet and armor, a visual design that pushed the water type significantly away from the naturalistic octopus interpretation and towards something that resembled military equipment, a creature outfitted in the style of a tank or an armored vehicle. The comparison to a tank was not accidental. The design was specific enough, the metal helmet and armor detailed enough, that the visual connection between Octillery's beta form and military armored machinery was clear and intentional. The eventual final design removed the armor and the helmet and presented Octillery as a more naturalistic interpretation of an octopus, round and organic, retaining the cannon-like mouth that gives the creature its name and its visual identity without the militaristic outfitting. And this is one of many beta design histories that reveals how far a Pokémon's concept can travel between initial idea and final form. The tank imagery did not survive the design process, but the name Octillery still carries the connection between the creature and artillery, between an octopus and a weapon, that the armor would have made visually explicit. Glastrier and Spectrier, the two legendary horses of the Crown Tundra, are Ice-type and Ghost-type respectively. These two typing choices were not made arbitrarily or simply for visual contrast between the two creatures. The specific types chosen for the two horses are the exact two types that are super effective against Calyrex, the legendary Pokémon they are each associated with through a fusion mechanic. Calyrex is a Psychic and Grass type. Ice-type moves hit Grass-type Pokémon for super effective damage. Ghost-type moves hit Psychic-type Pokémon for super effective damage. The two horses that can fuse with Calyrex are typed in the two ways that would be most effective against Calyrex in battle if the fusion were not in effect and they were opposing it instead. This creates a design relationship in which the most dangerous possible counters to Calyrex are the creatures that bond with it and become part of it. The things that could most easily threaten a standalone Calyrex are the things that Calyrex joins with, turning potential threat into unified power. The type matchup logic that makes Glastrier and Spectrier specifically dangerous to Calyrex is the same logic that makes them specifically suited to the fusion. Whether a player who encounters these legendaries and thinks through the type interactions reaches this conclusion on their own or encounters it as information from outside the game, the design intention becomes clear once the connection is made. The types were chosen with Calyrex's vulnerability in mind, and the relationship between the three Pokémon was built around that specific vulnerability being simultaneously the greatest strength of the fused form. Gym leader Roxanne leads the Rustboro City Gym in the Hoenn region and specializes in rock-type Pokémon, a fact that most players who progress through Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald know because her gym is the first one encountered and she provides the Stone Badge. She is a young leader who presents herself as a student of Pokémon by studying every aspect of them, including her battles with challengers. In Pokémon Emerald, rematches against gym leaders became possible through a feature that allowed players to revisit and battle the leaders again after the main game. Roxanne's rematch team in Emerald carries a detail that is easy to miss because it lives in data rather than in anything visible during the battle itself. Her initial gym battle in Emerald uses an all-female team of Pokémon, each individual member of her party being a female individual, Every single rematch uses an exclusively male party. The genders of every Pokémon in her lineup are reversed between the initial challenge and the rematches. This is not a detail that a player would notice during the battle through any obvious visual cue. Pokémon gender is visible in the game's interface, but it is the kind of information that passes without attracting deliberate attention unless a player is specifically looking for it. The fact that Roxanne's gender composition switches completely between first encounter and rematch is something discoverable through examination of the game's data rather than through careful observation of gameplay. Whether this was an intentional design choice, reflecting some thematic consideration about Roxanne, or a coincidence produced by how her rematch team was assembled, is not information the game's designers have provided. The pattern is simply there, consistent and specific for the player who goes looking. Clamperl is a water-type Pokémon that evolves into one of two possible forms depending on what it is holding when it is traded. Held item trading evolutions are a mechanic that appears throughout the franchise, requiring a Pokémon to be trading while holding a specific item to trigger a specific evolutionary outcome. Most Pokémon with this kind of evolution have one held item associated with one outcome. Clamperl has two. It can evolve into Huntail if traded while holding a Deep Sea Tooth, or into Gorbis if traded while holding a Deep Sea Scale. These are two completely different evolutionary outcomes produced by two completely different held items, and Clamperl is the only Pokémon in the franchise with this specific arrangement. No other Pokémon in the game's complete roster evolves by trade while holding two different possible items that lead to two different evolutions. This makes Clamperl's evolutionary record one of the more technically specific distinctions in the franchise. Not simply a Pokémon that branches, but a Pokémon that branches through the specific mechanism of trade while holding item in a way that is structurally unique. Eevee can evolve into many different forms, but its evolutionary triggers include stones and friendship and location and time of day, rather than the specific held item trade mechanic. The specificity of Clamperl's situation within that mechanic is what makes its record singular. For a player working through Hoenn and encountering Clamperl in the game's water routes, this branching evolution presented a genuine choice, requiring either planning ahead about which evolution was desired or acquiring a second Clamperl after the fact. The uniqueness of the arrangement was not something that changed how the player made the choice, but it was something that set this particular evolution decision apart from nearly every other the franchise offered. Lucario's signature move, Aurasphere, has an appearance and a Japanese name that connect it specifically to a piece of fighting game history that predates the Pokémon franchise by several years. Aurasphere is a fighting-type special move that manifests as a sphere of blue energy launched at the opponent. It is accurate, it cannot miss, and it is one of the more visually distinctive special moves in the franchise. In appearance, Aurasphere closely resembles the Hadoken, the iconic energy projectile from Street Fighter that has been one of the most recognizable attacks in fighting game history since the franchise's early entries. The visual language of a sphere of energy launched from the hands or body toward an opponent, the size and shape and color of the Pokémon franchise's version, draws clearly on the same visual vocabulary as the Street Fighter attack. The Japanese name of Aurasphere is Hadadon. The word Hadoken is built from words meaning surge and fist in Japanese. The name Hadadon maintains the beginning element, the surge or wave element, while substituting a different second element. The reference is not hidden or indirect. The first word of the Japanese name is a direct linguistic echo of the name that Street Fighter's attack has carried for decades. Lucario's moveset is built around the concept of aura, of sensing and projecting energy in ways that reflect the creature's special perceptive abilities. Aurasphere expresses this concept visually and mechanically, but the specific visual and linguistic choices that express it are reaching toward a piece of fighting game history and acknowledging that reach through the name that appears in the Japanese text of the game. Generation 1 enemy trainers, the trainers that a player faces across the various routes and buildings of the Kanto region, operate under a set of game mechanics that are in some ways simpler than the mechanics governing the player's own experience. One of those mechanical simplifications concerns power points, the resource that limits how many times a move can be used before it must be restored. For the player, power points are a genuine constraint. A move with 10 power points can only be used 10 times before the player must use an item or visit a Pokémon Center to restore it. Enemy trainers in Generation 1 do not use power points. When a trainer's Pokémon uses an attack, no power point is deducted from that move's available uses. The counter simply does not run for enemy trainers in these games. This means that an enemy trainer's Pokémon can theoretically use any of its moves an unlimited number of times across the same battle, while the player's Pokémon is working through a finite supply that decreases with each use. The practical implication of this is that a battle against an enemy trainer in Generation 1 could, theoretically, last indefinitely if the player chose to keep healing. As long as the player uses items to restore their Pokémon's health and power points, and as long as the enemy trainer's Pokémon cannot actually knock out the player's Pokémon, the battle can continue without any built-in end. The enemy trainer's moves never run out. The player's healing supply is the only finite resource in such a scenario. This asymmetry between player and trainer mechanics is one of many places where Generation 1 reveals how the game was structured before the systems that later generations added had been developed and applied consistently to every element of the game's population. The official canonical Pokémon lore in the games is generally consistent in its treatment of legendary Pokémon reproduction. Legendary Pokémon do not breed. The mechanics of the game enforce this, preventing legendary Pokémon from being placed in the Pokémon nursery or daycare in combinations that would produce eggs. The legendary status and the breeding restriction are understood to go together, to be part of what makes legendary Pokémon the specific category of creature they occupy. The anime does not share this consistent treatment. In a specific anime episode titled Pokémon, The Rise of Darkrai, though the more relevant instance appears in the episode referenced in the franchise as depicting an appearance by a baby Lugia, the anime shows a young Lugia, an offspring. A Lugia that is recognizably the same kind of creature but smaller and younger, in a developmental stage that would only make sense if Lugia reproduced and had offspring. Lugia in the games cannot produce offspring in any mechanic that the franchise provides. Its legendary classification and its egg group exclude it from the nursery breeding process. But the anime's continuity includes a baby Lugia as a real story element, acknowledging in visual storytelling that legendary Pokémon in the anime's version of the world do not carry the same reproductive restrictions that the game mechanics enforce. The two continuities have always maintained different relationships with the rules that govern the franchise's world. The anime is not a game and does not follow game mechanics, while games do not follow anime canon. But the gap between the game's position that Lugia cannot breed and the anime's presentation of a baby Lugia is wide enough that it represents a genuine discontinuity between the two versions of the franchise's world. Tauros received regional variants in the Paldea region of Scarlet and Violet, a trio of forms that expanded on the original normal type Tauros with new typings and new visual designs. The Combat breed, the Blaze breed, and the Aqua breed each brought a different elemental character to the basic bull design, distributing new types across a species that had previously been defined by a single form since Generation 1. What is remarkable about Tauros's regional variant situation in Generation 9 is not simply that it received regional variants, which many Pokémon have received in recent generations, but that it received three of them simultaneously in the same generation. No other Pokémon in the franchise's history has received three completely different regional forms in a single new generation of games. The parallel forms, the trio structure, the three distinct typings applied to a single species in one release, placed Tauros in a category of one within the history of how regional variants have been distributed. Most Pokémon that receive regional variants receive one, a Cantonian or Jotonian or Galarian form that reimagines the creature in the context of a new region. A few have received two across different games or at the same time. Tauros in Paldea received three, each one designed around a different element, each one available in specific areas of the Paldean region, each one adding to a species that had gone unchanged since the very first generation of games. For a creature that had been part of the franchise since the beginning and had not evolved or changed its form across 8 generations, the arrival of 3 regional variants simultaneously is a form of sudden expansion that no other species has experienced in quite the same way. The Pokémon franchise contains an internal geography that most players never think about as geography, as a system of connected spaces with real distances and real relationships. The routes and towns and cities that make up each region are presented through the lens of a game, through the camera that follows the player, and the map screen that shows relative position. But the underlying world is consistent enough that certain details reveal something about how large or small these regions actually are, and how specific those calculations have been made. In Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, there is a moment in which the game references a specific distance. The bridge that spans the northern part of Sinnoh, the one that connects different sections of the region across open water, is stated in the game's lore to be a specific length. That figure, when placed alongside what the player knows about the region from moving through it, creates a sense of scale that the gameplay experience alone does not communicate. The bridge is enormous. The water it crosses is vast. The region that contains both is larger than the top-down camera perspective suggests. Most players experience Sinnoh as a traversable space that takes a certain number of real-world minutes to cross. The lore that surrounds that traversal describes something much bigger, a region with mountain ranges and ocean passages and ancient ruins that would require considerable real-world time to cover on foot. The game and the world inside it have always existed at different scales, and the moments where internal lore provides specific measurements are the moments where the world briefly asserts its actual size. This is part of what makes the franchise's embedded geography interesting as a subject. The games ask the player to accept a compression of space in the service of playability, while simultaneously insisting, through entries and dialogue and specific measurements, that the world behind the compression is real and consistent and far larger than any play session reveals. The Pokédex number system carries its own history inside it, a history that is partially visible and partially hidden depending on how carefully a player examines the transitions between generations. The numbers appear to be a simple, sequential catalog, each Pokémon assigned a position in an ever-growing list that now extends into the hundreds and beyond. But the decisions made about how to assign those numbers and how to handle the exceptions and the edge cases that arose across generations tell a story about how the franchise has managed the tension between its original design and everything that came after. Mew sits at the end of the original 151, and its position there was not incidental. Mew was hidden in the code of Generation 1 and accessible only through specific means, a secret embedded in the game that was not part of the initial advertised experience. Placing it at 151 rather than leaving it unnumbered or assigning it a separate category acknowledged that it was real, that it was part of the official catalog, while also positioning it at the boundary of the expected list, one step past where the ordinary count ended. Every generation since has made decisions about which Pokémon belong in the regional Pokédex, which belong in the national Pokédex, and how newly discovered forms relate to the numbers already assigned. Pokémon that are given new forms in later generations do not receive new numbers. They retain their original positions in the catalog, while their new forms are noted alongside. A Pokémon that was number 300 in Generation 3 is still number 300 in Generation 9, even if it has forms that did not exist when the number was first assigned. This means that the Pokédex number carries the creature's history in a compressed way, anchoring it to the generation of its origin, while the forms and variants accumulated since then exist as annotations around that original position. The number is not just an identifier, it is a record of when the creature first officially existed. The Safari Zone across its various incarnations in the franchise has always been a space with different rules, and those different rules have always created a different kind of player experience than the ordinary wild encounter provides. In the standard wild encounter, a player can battle, can use status moves, can weaken a Pokémon systematically before attempting to capture it. The Safari Zone removes most of those options. Throwing bait, throwing rocks, throwing Safari balls, running, watching the Pokémon decide on its own turn whether to flee. The player's control over the encounter is dramatically reduced. This reduction of control is intentional and reflects a specific design philosophy about what the Safari Zone is supposed to represent within the game world. It is not a battlefield, it is a nature reserve. The Pokémon encountered there are not opponents to be defeated. They are creatures living in a protected space that the player has entered as a visitor. The mechanics communicate this distinction by removing the tools of combat and replacing them with the tools of an observer, someone who can offer or provoke, but cannot simply overpower. The Pokémon that are available in Safari Zones across different generations have often been some of the rarest available in those games, creatures that the player cannot obtain through any other means in their region. The combination of rare availability and reduced capture control creates encounters of high stakes and limited agency that feel genuinely different from the rest of the game's structure. A Pokémon that flees from a Safari Zone encounter takes something with it that the player may not recover. This design choice, placing rare Pokémon behind the mechanics of a space where the player cannot fight, creates a kind of tension that the standard capture system rarely produces. The player is not the most powerful entity in the encounter. The Pokémon's own decision to stay or flee carries as much weight as anything the player can do. Shiny Pokémon exists as one of the most celebrated forms of rarity in the franchise. Creatures that appear in alternate color palettes, with a small sparkle animation that announces their difference from ordinary encounters. The base encounter rate for a shiny Pokémon in most main series games without special mechanics applied is 1 in 4,096. This is a number that most dedicated players carry in mind because it contextualizes every long encounter session, every time a player has spent hours in the same patch of grass hoping for a specific color variation. But the shiny mechanic did not exist in Generation 1. Shiny Pokémon were introduced in Gold and Silver, and their existence in those games was tied to the game's internal stat system in a specific way. In Generation 2, a Pokémon's shiny status was determined entirely by its individual values, the hidden numbers that influence its stats in each category. A Pokémon with a specific combination of individual values in those categories was shiny. A Pokémon without that combination was not. Shininess was not an independent, random determination, but a product of what the creature's stat profile happened to be. This created an interesting situation when players transferred Pokémon between generations, or when certain Pokémon were found to be shiny through the exploitation of particular mechanics. The shiny status was genuinely encoded in the creature's biology, in its stats, rather than being a separate flag attached to it. A shiny Pokémon in Generation 2 was statistically unusual in ways that went beyond its color. Later generations separated the shiny determination from the stat system entirely, making it an independent random outcome rather than a consequence of stat distribution. This changed the relationship between shiny status and what it implied about a Pokémon's underlying qualities, making shininess purely cosmetic in mechanical terms. In Generation 2, it was briefly something more. The move sketch is the defining move of Smeargle, and it exists nowhere else in the franchise in any form. Sketch allows Smeargle to permanently copy the last move used by its opponent, adding that move to its own known moves in place of Sketch itself. Each Smeargle can use Sketch 4 times across its 4 move slots, and each use of Sketch can copy a different move. Through this mechanism, Smeargle can theoretically know any 4 moves in the game's entire move pool, almost any 4 moves. There are moves that cannot be copied by Sketch, moves that the game explicitly excludes from the Sketch mechanic for reasons that generally relate to their unique status. Chatter, the move exclusive to Chatot, could not be copied for a period of its existence in the franchise due to its voice recording mechanic in certain games. Struggle, the last resort move that any Pokémon uses when all its power points have been depleted, cannot be copied because it is not a move that appears in any normal move slot. A few other moves across the franchise's history have been excluded for various technical or design reasons. But the vast majority of the move pool is open to Smeargle through Sketch, which creates a situation in competitive and casual play alike that no other Pokémon can replicate. A Smeargle with Spore and King's Shield and Shell Smash and any 4th move of the player's choosing is a creature assembled from the move pools of 4 different Pokémon, carrying combinations that should not be possible in a single team member. The franchise has managed this by keeping Smeargle's base stats very low, ensuring that its access to the move pool is not also accompanied by the power to fully exploit every move it can copy. The move sketch itself, the mechanism behind all of this, is unlike any other move in the game. It does not deal damage. It does not change the battlefield. It simply reads the last thing that happened and becomes it. There is something almost philosophical about a move whose entire function is transformation, whose result is its own disappearance and replacement by whatever the moment provided. The Pokémon Shedinja is built around a contradiction that the game presents as biology. When Nincada evolves into Ninjask, a second Pokémon appears in the player's party if they have an empty slot and a spare Pokéball available. That second Pokémon is Shedinja, and it appears without any action from the player other than allowing the evolution to occur. It is the shed shell of the Nincada that transformed, the empty husk that the creature left behind when it became something new. Shedinja has 1 hit point, 1, not a low number, not a rounded low value, exactly 1 in every game in which it has ever appeared, in every situation under any mechanic. A single hit point is not a disadvantage that can be built around through training or held items in any ordinary sense. It is the fixed biological reality of a creature that is, in the game's lore, an empty shell with no living substance to speak of. But Shedinja has Wonder Guard, an ability that exists nowhere else as a naturally occurring ability in the franchise. Wonder Guard makes the user immune to every move that is not super effective against it, Shedinja is a ghost and bug type, and the combination of those two types means that only fire, flying, rock, ghost, and dark type moves will actually affect it. Every other move in the game, every physical attack and special attack and status move that does not belong to those 5 types will simply fail to touch it. 1 hit point, protected by immunity to almost every move. A Pokémon that cannot survive a single hit from anything that does land, but that most things cannot land at all. The existence of Shedinja in a game that is otherwise structured around building durability through training and held items and careful stat distribution is a quiet disruption of every principle that the rest of the game teaches. The internal clock that runs in the Generation 2 games, Gold and Silver and Crystal, was set when those games were first played and has been running ever since in cartridges that have held their battery power. The clock governs time-based events, the Pokémon that appear at different hours of the day and night, the Pokémon that evolve through friendship during specific periods, the in-game calendar that advances with real-world time, all of it tied to a battery that was never meant to run indefinitely. Original Generation 2 cartridges have in many cases experienced battery failure, the small circular battery inside the cartridge finally exhausting itself after years of maintaining the save data and the running clock. When the battery dies, the save data is preserved in the game's memory for a time, but the clock stops. Events that depend on the clock continue to reference the frozen time at which the battery gave out, and eventually, the save data itself becomes unreliable. Players who return to original cartridges decades after their last play session sometimes encounter this as a kind of temporal relic, a game that has been frozen at a specific moment in time, whose internal world stopped advancing on a specific day years in the past. The Pokémon that should only appear at night appear permanently or never, depending on when the clock stopped. The calendar events that should shift with the seasons remain fixed on whichever season the game last recorded. There is something gently melancholic about this. A game that was designed to mirror real time, to change as the real world changed, stopped changing on a specific day, and has remained there. The creatures inside it have been waiting in a fixed moment, unaware that time continued outside the cartridge, keeping whatever hour the battery last maintained. Pokémon breeding was introduced in Generation 2 and has remained one of the franchise's more complex systems ever since, a mechanic with enough depth that entire competitive player communities have developed extensive knowledge of how it functions at levels far below what any casual playthrough requires. The visible surface of the system is simple enough. 2 compatible Pokémon left at the nursery will eventually produce an egg. The egg hatches into a Pokémon of the mother's species. Below that surface, the breeding mechanic governs the inheritance of hidden stats, of abilities, of moves, of nature, all of them transmitted from parent to offspring, according to rules that are mostly invisible during casual play, but enormously significant for players who are building competitive teams with optimized stat distributions. A Pokémon's individual values, the hidden numbers that shape its final stats in each category, are inherited partially from its parents in ways that held items and specific breeding conditions can influence. The Destiny Knot, a held item, causes a breeding Pokémon to pass 5 of its 6 individual values to its offspring rather than the usual smaller number. A player who wants to breed a Pokémon with perfect individual values in every stat uses Destiny Knots across multiple generations of breeding, gradually consolidating the desired values into a single offspring. This process can take many real-world hours and requires tracking which values have been passed and which still need to be replaced. The depth of the breeding system is one of the markers of how seriously the franchise has always taken its competitive dimension alongside its casual one. A system this detailed was not designed for a player who simply wants to complete the story. It was designed for a player who wants to optimize, who wants to understand the underlying numbers and manipulate them toward a specific end. The surface is simple. The interior is elaborate. Most players never visit the interior. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town in Generation 1 is a location whose surrounding context became one of the franchise's most enduring pieces of player mythology. Lavender Town itself, the music that plays there, the ghost that appears before the player obtains the Sylph Scope, the graves that fill the tower, all of these combined into an atmosphere that was genuinely unusual for the games surrounding it. A town built around a memorial, a location where the dead are acknowledged and kept. The music of Lavender Town has been the subject of considerable discussion and legend in the decades since the games were released. Most of that discussion existing in the space between fact and fiction that internet mythology occupies. What is factual is that the original Japanese version of the Lavender Town music used certain tones and a particular arrangement that was adjusted for international releases. The adjustments were documented, and the reasoning was related to the overall audio mix, rather than to any sinister purpose, but the mythology surrounding the music grew independently of those documented facts. The tower itself contains something that is simply true without requiring any supplementary mythology to be interesting. It is a location in a game aimed primarily at children that presents death directly and without deflection. The graves in the tower belong to Pokémon. Some of them were abandoned by their trainers. Some of them died in the course of journeys. The old woman who appears there grieves for a specific Pokémon who is named. The ghost that the player initially cannot interact with is eventually revealed through the story to be the ghost of that specific Pokémon. A game that asks players to battle and catch and train creatures and defeat opponents also contains a tower where those creatures are mourned when they are gone. Both things are present in the same game, in the same tonal universe, in a way that the franchise has rarely addressed as explicitly since. The phrase same type attack bonus, abbreviated to a term that competitive players have used for decades, describes a mechanic that is woven into the deepest structure of how battles in the franchise function. When a Pokémon uses a move that matches one of its own types, the move's power is multiplied by 1.5. A Fire-type Pokémon using a Fire-type move does significantly more damage than a non-Fire-type Pokémon using the same move with the same base power. This mechanic is simple enough to understand at the surface level. Type matching gives bonus damage. But the implications of that simple rule, spread across a game with hundreds of Pokémon and hundreds of moves and an enormous variety of type combinations, create a landscape of calculations that experienced players navigate continuously. A dual-type Pokémon benefits from the bonus on moves of either of its types. A Pokémon with adaptability, a specific ability, has the bonus increased from 1.5 to 2, making the type match even more significant. The mechanic was present from Generation 1 and has never been altered in its fundamental operation, even as everything around it has changed. New types have been added, new abilities have been introduced, new moves with new mechanics have expanded what battles can include. Through all of it, the type bonus has remained as 1.5, as reliable as any rule the franchise has ever established. Players who do not know the term but have played the games extensively still know the rule intuitively. They know that their fire-type Pokémon hits harder with fire moves. They may not have quantified the bonus or named it, but they have experienced it in every battle and built their understanding of how to play around it. The mechanic is so embedded in the game's structure that it feels less like a rule and more like a physical property of the world. Abra presents a specific challenge to any player who encounters it in the wild for the first time. and attempts to capture it without prior knowledge of how it behaves. Abra uses teleport immediately on its first available turn in a wild encounter, not as a strategic decision, no, not in response to any particular situation, simply as its automatic behavior, the one thing it does before a player has any opportunity to do anything at all. A player who finds Abra in the wild, who enters the encounter excited about the prospect of catching a psychic type at that early stage of the game, watches it disappear before a single action can be taken. This creates a capture problem that requires either prior knowledge of the behavior and preparation for it, or a specific game mechanic that prevents the escape. Look, a move that prevents the opponent from fleeing, can be used before Abra teleports if the player's Pokémon is fast enough and the player knows to use it. A Pokémon with the ability Shadow Tag or Arena Trap, which prevent opponents from switching or fleeing, automatically stops the teleport from succeeding. A Master Ball bypasses the problem entirely, but costs the player their most valuable capture resource for a Pokémon that is not otherwise difficult to obtain once the escape problem is solved. Abra's immediate teleport is one of the more memorable design decisions in the franchise's history of wild encounter behavior, a small mechanical statement that communicates character through gameplay rather than through text. Abra is a creature defined by psychic power and by its habit of sleeping through most of its waking life, using its psychic abilities automatically without conscious effort. The immediate teleport is consistent with who Abra is. It is not trying to escape. It is simply doing what it does, and the player has wandered into the path of that automatic behavior. The Elite Four structure is one of the franchise's most consistent organizational features, the gauntlet of 4 powerful trainers that stands between the player and the champion in most main series games. The format has appeared in every mainline regional game in some form, adapted slightly for specific regions, but maintaining its core structure of 4 opponents encountered sequentially with the option to return to a healing station between battles. But the specific 4 trainers in any given Elite Four and the order in which they can be challenged has varied in ways that are not always visible to the player during a first playthrough. Some Elite Fours must be challenged in a fixed order, the first member always first, the fourth always fourth, the sequence mandatory. Others allow the player to choose the order of the first several members, approaching the chamber of any Elite Four member available and selecting their own sequence before the final member locks into place. The distinction matters in ways that are primarily strategic. A player who can choose their order can manage type matchups across the sequence, saving team members who are well suited to certain encounters while leading with others against opponents where the advantage is clear. A player in a fixed order Elite Four must prepare their team to handle whichever lineup the game dictates in whichever sequence the structure requires. The Johto Elite Four is notable for being one of the more flexible examples of the structure in early generations, while the Kanto Elite Four in the original games locked the player into a specific path. The shift between rigid and flexible ordering across the franchise's history is one of those design decisions that most players absorbed as a feature of a specific region without thinking about it as a deliberate choice that could have gone differently. The item Leftovers has been one of the most consistently useful held items in the franchise's competitive history, a held item that restores a fraction of the holding Pokemon's maximum hit points at the end of each turn. The percentage restored is small, 1/16 of the holder's maximum hit points, but applied turn after turn across a long battle, the accumulated restoration is significant. A Pokémon with Leftovers in a prolonged defensive engagement is effectively receiving continuous healing without any player action required. Leftovers first appeared in Generation 2 and have remained present and relevant in virtually every subsequent generation, one of the few items that has maintained consistent competitive viability across the franchise's entire history. In a game where held items come and go in usefulness depending on the current metagame, the specific mechanics of introduced abilities, and the power level of new Pokémon, leftovers represent something almost like a constant, a reliable tool whose value does not depend on any particular mechanic other than surviving longer than the opponent. The item's name is one of the more quietly charming details in the franchise's item naming history. Leftovers, not a restoration item or a healing capsule or a named technological device. A container of leftovers, of food that remained after a meal, being used by a Pokémon during battle to gradually recover. The mundane name applied to a strategically significant item creates a small gap between what the item sounds like and what it does, and that gap is part of what makes it memorable. The lore implications of how a Pokémon uses leftovers during battle are something the franchise has never explained and does not need to. The mechanic is clean and useful, and the name is charming, and that is all it needs to be. But for a player who pauses to think about it, the image of a Pokémon periodically eating leftovers during a high-stakes battle carries its own quiet humor. Pokémon Snap was released for the Nintendo 64 in 1999 and represented a complete departure from the gameplay structure of the main series. Rather than catching, training, and battling, the player rode a fixed rail through environments populated by wild Pokémon and used a camera to photograph them. The goal was not to accumulate the strongest team, but to capture images of sufficient quality, the Pokémon centered, large enough in the frame, in interesting poses, ideally performing behaviors that were not available in ordinary circumstances. The game's scoring system evaluated photographs on multiple dimensions, and understanding how to maximize scores required learning the behaviors that different Pokémon performed under specific conditions. Throwing an apple near a Bulbasaur triggered a different animation than throwing a Pester Ball. Hitting a specific object in the environment with a Pester Ball could trigger a chain reaction that caused a Pokémon to emerge from a location it otherwise would not appear in. The photographs with the highest possible scores required not just luck, but specific knowledge of what each Pokémon was capable of and how to trigger it. New Pokémon Snap, released in 2021, expanded on this concept with the technology available to the Nintendo Switch, allowing for larger environments, more Pokémon species, and a scoring system that rewarded pose, expression, context, and framing. The fundamental design philosophy of the original was preserved: the observer rather than the battler, the camera rather than the Pokeball, the encounter understood as something to witness rather than something to dominate. The Snap games occupy a specific location in the franchise's history as the fullest expression of an alternative relationship with the Pokémon world, one in which the player's power is the power of attention rather than the power of force. The rarest and most beautiful photographs in Snap are rare in the same way that meaningful observations in the real world are rare, because seeing something clearly and completely and at the right moment is its own form of accomplishment. The move Thunder has a base accuracy of 70%, which places it among the less reliable moves in its category. An electric-type move with 110 base power but only a 70% chance to hit is a significant gamble in any battle, especially in high-stakes encounters where a miss can mean the difference between winning and losing. Most players who think about Thunder's accuracy recognize it as a trade-off, power for reliability, a choice made deliberately rather than by oversight. But Thunder's accuracy is not fixed. Under certain weather conditions, specifically during rain, Thunder's accuracy becomes 100%. The move that is otherwise unreliable becomes perfectly accurate when the sky is already full of water. In Sunshine, the accuracy drops further to 50%, making it an even worse gamble in the wrong weather than it is under neutral conditions. This accuracy modification is part of a broader system of weather interactions that the franchise has built around certain moves and abilities, and Pokémon, a system in which the state of the battlefield as a whole environment influences what is possible within it. Thunder and rain is the most dramatic example of this system as it applies to accuracy, because the shift from 70 to 100% is not a minor adjustment, but a complete removal of the gamble. Under the right conditions, the most powerful electric-type move in the game is also a guaranteed hit. Players who know this detail and build their teams around summoning rain before using thunder are working with a genuine strategic advantage over players who treat thunder as simply an inaccurate option compared to its alternatives. The detail is not hidden. It appears in the move's description, but it is specific enough that it requires attention to register and remember. The Pokémon Magikarp is one of the franchise's most enduring symbols, a creature whose entire identity is built around being spectacularly useless and then, eventually, transforming into something spectacularly powerful. Magikarp can use the move Splash and almost nothing else through level up. Splash does nothing. The move's description says it explicitly. Nothing happens when a Pokémon uses Splash. A Magikarp in battle uses its turn to accomplish exactly nothing, and then the turn ends, and the opponent does whatever it was going to do. The gap between Magikarp and Gyarados, its evolution, is one of the widest in the franchise in terms of the perceived power difference between pre-evolution and evolved form. Gyarados is a fearsome water and flying type with a base stat total far above what anyone would expect to emerge from a creature that flops around in ponds. The transformation is so dramatic that it became one of the founding myths of the franchise, the thing players learned about early and worked toward across the tedium of raising a creature that could not contribute to battles in any meaningful way. But Magikarp can use Jump in the Pokémon Magikarp Jump mobile game, a spin-off built entirely around the concept of how high Magikarp can leap. Within that game, Magikarp's one physical capability, the leaping it manages even in the main series before it evolves, becomes the entire focus of a gameplay system. The game takes the one thing a Magikarp can do and builds an entire experience around doing it better. This is the franchise honoring a joke by taking it seriously. Magikarp is useless, and then someone asked how high it could jump, and that question became a game, and the answer is the point. The Pokémon world contains a substance called honey that players can apply to specific trees in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl to attract wild Pokémon. The mechanic requires waiting in real time, returning to a tree hours after applying the honey to see whether anything appeared, and if so, engaging the encounter. The Pokémon that can appear through this method include some that cannot be found through any other means in those games, making Honey Tree hunting a necessary activity for players pursuing a complete Pokédex. Among the Pokémon that can appear in a Honey Tree is Munchlax, and the rate at which Munchlax appears is one of the most discussed low probabilities in the franchise. The base encounter rate for Munchlax from Honey Trees is approximately 1%, and it is not distributed equally across all trees. The specific trees where Munchlax can appear are determined by a calculation involving the player's trainer ID and the position of the tree in the game's internal map, and only a few trees per save file can ever produce Munchlax regardless of how many trees are smeared with honey. A player who does not know which trees on their specific file can produce Munchlax is applying honey to trees that can never give them what they are looking for and waiting hours between each attempt. The calculation that determines the Munchlax trees is not visible to the player through any in-game means. It requires external knowledge of how the calculation works to identify the right trees without exhaustive testing. This is one of the more demanding hidden mechanics in the franchise's history, not because the goal is difficult once the method is understood, but because discovering the method from within the game alone, without outside information, would require a patience and a systematic approach that goes far beyond what most players bring to any individual mechanic. The champion of the Pokémon League in each region is the final formal obstacle before the player is recognized as the new champion, and across the franchise's history, those champions have carried distinct identities that reflect their regions and their approaches to the game. Blue in Generation 1 is memorable for his aggression and his rivalry. Lancin Giotto is defined by his devotion to dragon types and his dramatic presence. Stephen Stone in Hoenn brings a quiet, scholarly quality to his steel and rock type team. Cynthia in Sinnoh is widely regarded as one of the most difficult champions in the franchise's history. Cynthia's difficulty is specific and documented. Her team in Diamond and Pearl and Platinum includes a Garchomp, and that Garchomp in Platinum is at level 78 with a diverse and powerful moveset that covers its weaknesses in ways that a player relying on type advantage alone will not easily exploit. Her team is not a collection of powerful Pokémon of a single type, but a diverse roster that has been constructed with coverage and synergy in mind, the kind of team that reflects a champion who actually understands the game's strategy rather than simply having strong Pokémon. The specific structure of Cynthia's team, the way it punishes unprepared approaches and rewards the player who has thought carefully about type coverage and held items and move selection, is one of the markers of how the franchise's difficulty has varied across its champions. Some champions are clearly designed as narrative endpoints rather than genuine strategic challenges. Cynthia is designed as both, a character with a specific personality and role in the story, and a trainer who will genuinely defeat a player who arrives without adequate preparation. Her reputation among players who have encountered her is consistent across generations. Players who faced her at the time of Diamond and Pearl's original release remember the encounter as one of the more demanding in their history with the franchise. That reputation has been maintained rather than revised downward as the years have passed. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon is a sub-franchise within the broader Pokémon umbrella that positions the player not as a human trainer who catches and battles Pokémon, but as a Pokémon itself, navigating a world where humans do not exist or have left, where Pokémon communities function as societies with their own organizations and histories and internal conflicts. The narrative frame of the Mystery Dungeon games is that the player, a human in real life, has been transformed into a Pokémon and has no memory of their prior existence. The Rescue Team games, the first pair in the series released for Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS, established this premise with a story that touches on themes of belonging and purpose and sacrifice that were unusual for games targeted at the age range the franchise typically addressed. A player who completed the story of Red Rescue Team or Blue Rescue Team reached an ending that was genuinely emotional in ways that most players were not prepared for, an ending that involved a resolution of the player character's situation that is bittersweet rather than straightforwardly triumphant. Explorers of Time and Explorers of Darkness, the second pair, expanded the emotional scope further, with a story that involved time travel and the prevention of a catastrophic future, and a sacrifice made by the partner character that created one of the most discussed emotional moments in the franchise's adjacent history. Players who had been children when they encountered this story carried the memory of it for years, sometimes decades, as one of the unexpectedly affecting experiences in their gaming history. The Mystery Dungeon games exist in a specific place within the franchise where the emotional register is different from the main series, where the absence of the trainer and Pokémon relationship is replaced by something that asks different questions about identity and belonging and what it means to be a creature in this world. The number of moves in the franchise's move pool has grown considerably across 9 generations, and within that growth, certain categories have remained consistent in ways that make specific moves stand out by comparison. The highest base power of any move in the franchise belongs to moves that exist at the outer edge of what has been designed, moves so powerful that their use is typically tied to conditions that prevent them from being applicable in every situation. Explosion and self-destruct are normal type moves that deal massive damage by causing the user to faint immediately upon use. Their base powers are among the highest in the game, and their strategic function is to deal an enormous amount of damage in a single turn at the cost of the user's continued participation in the battle. A Pokémon that uses Explosion is spending itself, converting its remaining vitality into a single devastating strike. What changed about these moves between generations is specifically how the game calculated the damage they dealt. In generations before Generation 5, Explosion and Self-Destruct had a mechanic that halved the opponent's defense when calculating damage, making them even more effective against defensively oriented Pokémon than the base power alone suggested. Generation 5 removed this defense-halving mechanic, significantly reducing the practical power of Explosion and Self-Destruct in competitive play and changing how those moves were used and valued. The change was substantial enough that it shifted the competitive viability of both moves and the Pokémon that were primarily associated with them. A move's usefulness is not only a function of its base power, but of the full calculation that determines how much damage it deals, and altering one input to that calculation can change the move's role in competitive play as significantly as changing the base power number itself. The Pokémon world contains an organization called the International Police, and its most visible member across the franchise's games is a character who goes by a code name rather than a given name. Looker, as this character is known, appears across multiple generations and multiple regions in the franchise, making him one of the few recurring human characters who is clearly the same individual across different game settings, rather than a different character who happens to share a role. Looker's presence across multiple regions creates something unusual for a franchise, where most human characters are specific to the region whose game they appear in. The gym leaders of Kanto are Kanto's gym leaders. The champion of Sinnoh is Sinnoh's champion. They do not generally appear in other regions' games as the same individual continuing the same story. Looker does. He appears in Sinnoh and then reappears in Unova, and then in Kalos, each time as the same investigating agent working on cases that are specific to each region but connected to the larger ongoing work of the International Police. The use of a code name rather than a given name for this character is itself a detail that the franchise treats as significant. A character who goes by Looker in every context that the player encounters him, who does not offer a given name in any of those contexts, is a character whose identity is constructed around his role rather than around a personal history. The name describes the function. The person behind the function is withheld. This makes Looker one of the more genuinely mysterious, recurring characters in the franchise's human cast, a character whose mystery is maintained not through dramatic revelation withheld, but through the simple ongoing absence of the information that would make him ordinary. The in-game time system that governs day and night cycles in the franchise has not been consistent across every game, and the differences in how time is handled from one generation to another reflect decisions about what role the real world's passage of time should play in the game experience. Generation 2 introduced the real-time clock and built significant gameplay content around it. Pokémon that appear at night, events that trigger on specific days of the week, a calendar that advances with the real calendar. The game was designed to be lived alongside real time, rather than completed in a single extended session. Some later generations departed from this design philosophy significantly. The original Ruby and Sapphire introduced a time system, but did not include day and night cycle effects on wild Pokémon encounter rates in the way Generation 2 had. Certain evolutions that required high friendship during specific times of day were functional, but the rich ecosystem of time-dependent encounters that made Johto feel like a living world was simplified. The Hoenn games were criticized by some players at the time for this reduction. Later games restored and expanded time-dependent mechanics in various forms, with Sun and Moon introducing a time-based system that inverted the real-world clock, making the in-game day occur during real-world night, and vice versa, a change designed to accommodate players who primarily played during evening or nighttime hours in regions where the games were released. A game that knew its players were playing at night and shifted its internal time to give them access to daytime content rather than keeping them in perpetual darkness. The history of how the franchise has handled time is the history of a design question asked repeatedly across decades. Should the game mirror the world the player is in, or should it exist independently of it? The answer has changed with each generation, and the changes have reflected different theories about what the game is for and who is playing it. The Pokémon Ditto is defined by transformation, and the implications of Ditto's transformative ability have been explored in the franchise's lore in ways that extend beyond the single mechanic of copying an opponent's form in battle. Ditto can breed with almost any Pokémon, producing eggs of the non-Ditto partner species, which makes it an invaluable tool for players who want to breed for specific natures or individual values or egg moves. A Ditto in the nursery with any breedable Pokémon creates a pair that can produce offspring, regardless of the species or gender of the non-Ditto partner. This breeding versatility is related to Ditto's fundamental biology. A Pokémon that can take the form of anything must, at some level, also be compatible with anything at a biological level that allows for the production of offspring. The franchise handles this as a game mechanic without elaborating on the biological specifics, which is appropriate, but the mechanic implies a relationship between form and reproduction that is more extensive than what either the normal breeding system or the battle transformation would suggest on their own. The Pokédex entries for Ditto across generations describe it as capable of perfectly copying any Pokémon's cellular structure, which gestures toward an explanation of how the transformation is mechanically possible at a biological level. If cellular structure can be perfectly replicated, then compatibility for producing offspring may be a consequence of that perfect replication rather than a separate capability. The franchise does not say this, but the entries and the mechanic together suggest it. Ditto is one of the Pokémon whose design most rewards the player who thinks about what the world the game describes would actually contain, rather than simply accepting the mechanic at the level at which it is presented. The Pokémon franchise has released main series games in pairs since its beginning, paired versions that share most of their content but differ in specific Pokémon availability, in specific story elements, and occasionally in version-exclusive features that give each version a distinct identity even within their shared structure. Red and Blue, Gold and Silver, Ruby and Sapphire. The pattern is fundamental enough that it has become part of how players think about each generation, the choice of version preceding the experience of the game itself. The reasons for the paired release structure have been stated by the franchise's creators at various points and relate to the social dimension of the game, the trading mechanic that requires interaction between players to complete the Pokédex, the design intention that no single version would contain every Pokémon, and that completion would require communication and exchange between players. The paired structure makes the trading system necessary rather than optional for completionist goals. But the paired structure also creates version-exclusive Pokémon that have become associated with specific games in ways that go beyond their availability. The exclusives of each version pair are not simply Pokémon that happen to be in one game and not the other. They become markers of identity for the version they belong to, creatures that represent something about the version's specific character. Lugia and Ho-Oh, Groudon and Kyogre, Dialga and Palkia. The version legendaries are the most visible examples, but the version exclusives throughout the Pokédex carry similar associations. A player who chose one version over another in a specific generation often did so partly based on which version exclusives appealed to them, which creatures they wanted to have in their party. That choice, made before the game began, shaped the experience of the game in ways that persisted through the entire playthrough. Route 1 in Kanto is the very first route in the very first main series game, the path that connects Pallet Town to Viridian City, the stretch of tall grass and open sky that introduced the concept of wild Pokémon encounters to every player who has ever played a Pokémon game. It is not a long route. It is not a complex one. It is designed to be the simplest possible introduction to the game's core mechanic. A short walk that teaches the player what tall grass means and what to do when something appears in it. The Pokémon that appear on Route 1 in the original games are Pidgey and Rattata, common bird and rodent Pokémon that exist in the game's design as teaching tools more than as desirable catches. They are present to demonstrate the encounter system, to give the player a place to learn how to battle and to capture without the encounters being demanding or the stakes being high. Route 1 in Generation 1 is as uncomplicated as a route can be, but Route 1 has appeared in various forms across multiple games and remakes, and each iteration has introduced its own context around the same basic path. Fire Red and Leaf Green preserved the original route. Heart Gold and Soul Silver referenced it through the structure of the Kanto section, available after completing the Johto story. Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee rebuilt the route with the new catching mechanic and the overworld encounter system, where Pokémon are visible moving through the environment before any encounter begins. Each version of Route 1 is the same place and a different place simultaneously, shaped by the mechanics and the systems and the visual style of the game it appears in. The route that has always been the simplest path in the franchise carries within it the entire history of how the franchise has changed, visible in how its most basic element has been rebuilt across decades of development. The item known as the Amulet Coin doubles the money a player receives from trainer battles when held by a Pokémon that participated in the battle. Money in the franchise is used to purchase items from Pokémarts, items that range from essential restoration supplies to enhancement tools that are useful but not critical, and the accumulation of money across a playthrough determines how well supplied a player can be at any given moment without having to rely on items found in the field. The Amulet Coin is typically available fairly early in most games that include it, usually through a specific character or location that requires some exploration but is not gated behind significant story progression. A player who equips the Amulet Coin and maintains it on a participating Pokémon for the majority of their playthrough accumulates significantly more money than a player who ignores it, simply because it is doubling the payout of every trainer battle the holder participates in. The strategic dimension of the Amulet Coin is low because the mechanic it applies to, money accumulation, is generally not a source of significant difficulty in most Pokémon games. Money is plentiful enough through normal play that most players never feel a genuine shortage. But the amulet coin is a small efficiency optimization that rewards the player who remembers to use it, and the compounding effect of doubling every trainer payment across an entire playthrough creates a meaningful difference in how well stocked the player is when they arrive at the game's more demanding sections. The item is one of the many small tools the franchise offers that rewards attention without punishing inattention, that makes the experience somewhat smoother for players who engage with it, without making the experience significantly worse for players who do not. The Pokémon franchise has always maintained a distinction between the games and the anime, and that distinction means that information about a Pokémon that appears in one medium does not automatically apply to the other. The anime has shown Pokémon performing feats, using moves, and exhibiting behaviors that are not reflected in the game mechanics. The games have included lore and Pokédex entries and character dialogue that is not reflected in the visual storytelling of the anime. The two continuities are related, but not identical. This distinction becomes particularly visible when players encounter specific pieces of franchise lore that appear in one medium and then check whether the other acknowledges them. Pokédex entries that describe Pokémon as being capable of generating temperatures that would vaporize a human body, or of producing gravitational fields that affect the space around them, describe a world with significantly higher stakes than the gameplay experience suggests. The entries are written as natural history documentation, as descriptions of what these creatures actually do in the world. The gap between what the Pokédex says and what the battles show is one of the franchise's most consistent internal tensions. A Pokémon that can supposedly reach the surface temperature of the sun and a Pokémon that can survive contact with one are both participating in the same turn-based battle system, exchanging damage in amounts governed by base stats and type matchups. The lore and the mechanics operate at different scales and do not require reconciliation because they are serving different purposes. But for a player who takes both seriously, who reads the Pokédex entries carefully and thinks about what they describe, the world of Pokémon contains something much stranger and more dangerous than the gameplay experience communicates. The entries are where the franchise occasionally allows its world to become genuinely uncanny, and the gap between the entry and the encounter is part of what that world is. The Battle Frontier, which appeared most fully developed in Pokémon Emerald, is one of the most ambitious competitive structures the franchise has built into a main series game. Beyond the main story, beyond the Elite Four and the Champion and the post-game events that extend the playthrough, the Battle Frontier offers a series of distinct battle facilities, each with its own rules and its own structure and its own prize currency and its own frontier brain who can be challenged once a specific win streak has been achieved. The 7 facilities of Emerald's Battle Frontier each create a different competitive environment that tests different aspects of strategic understanding. The Battle Tower tests sustained performance across extended win streaks. The Battle Factory provides rental Pokémon rather than the player's own team, testing the player's ability to draft and work with unfamiliar tools. The Battle Pike presents encounters with unknown content behind doors that must be chosen without foreknowledge. Each facility is a different question about what it means to understand Pokémon battles. The frontier brains who guard the highest tier of each facility are among the most difficult opponents in the franchise's history, trainers who use fully optimized teams with competitive movesets and held items and built around strategies that punish unprepared approaches. Defeating a frontier brain in a facility after achieving the required streak is considered a significant accomplishment, even among experienced players. The Battle Frontier in Emerald is often cited as an example of the franchise at its most ambitious in its treatment of the competitive dimension of the game, a post-game structure so deep and so demanding that it extended the game's lifespan for dedicated players far beyond anything the main story required. The Pokémon Slowpoke became the subject of one of the franchise's most fondly remembered moments of environmental storytelling when the Azalea Town subplot in Gold and Silver revealed that Team Rocket had been cutting off Slowpoke tails and selling them as a delicacy. The Slowpoke that wandered Azalea Town with severed tails were walking evidence of the villain organization's cruelty, and the player's first task in the region was to enter the well beneath the town and stop the ongoing operation. The Slowpoke tail as a food item is not simply a piece of villain backstory. The game treats it as a real commodity within the world's economy, something with a market value and a consumer base, and a supply chain that Team Rocket was criminally exploiting. The Pokémon world contains people who eat Slowpoke tail, who consider it valuable enough to pay for it, and who presumably do not know or do not care how it is obtained. This is one of the more ethically complex implications that the franchise has embedded in its world without making it the explicit subject of a lesson. The Slowpoke tail subplot is framed as a crime because of how the tails are obtained, through the exploitation of a protected species in a protected area, not because of what they ultimately become. The world the game describes has a functional economy around a product derived from a Pokémon, and the problem is the method rather than the practice. The Slowpoke themselves, the franchise notes, grow their tails back, which resolves one ethical concern while leaving the broader question of the relationship between the world's economy and its Pokémon population as a background detail that rewards any player who pauses to think about what the subplot implies. There is something that happens at the end of a long journey through the franchise's hidden details that cannot be replicated by encountering those details one at a time, spread across different contexts and different moments of discovery. When they are gathered and held together, when the pattern of what the franchise hides and where it hides it becomes visible all at once, what emerges is a picture of a creative world that has always taken its own internal logic seriously, that has always thought more carefully than any one player's playthrough could ever reveal, that has always had more going on in it than the surface of its games communicated to the players moving through them. Every fact that seemed impossible to believe was real. Every number that seemed too specific was the actual number. Every naming choice that seemed decorative was chosen with intention. The franchise has been doing this since Generation 1, embedding these small truths in the edges of the experience, in the code and the names and the Pokédex entries and the dialogue of characters that most players passed in a moment and forgot. The details that no player knew or that only 1% of players found were never secrets in the hostile sense. They were not locked away or protected. They were simply quiet, waiting with the patience of things that have been sitting in the same place for a very long time and have learned not to expect company. They exist in the franchise the way important things sometimes exist in the world, present and true and unremarked, until the moment when someone stops and looks and finds them there. Thanks for watching. If these stories helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.